Hey everybody, what's going on? So first of all, I just want to apologize. My mic is being a little weird, so if I sound off, I don't know why, but that's it's something to do with my mic. I don't know what's going on. But putting that aside, I wanted to jump in here at the beginning of the episode because I needed to do the question for this episode. Last time I asked you guys who your favorite character in FE6 was, but the question was not out at the point that we recorded this episode, so I needed to hop in and take care of that. So yeah, let's just get right into it. I got a few answers over on Twitter, and then of course I'm going to discuss my own opinion on the matter. So, at Cool Guy as F says, Shanna, she's a super rewarding unit to use, and her personality / supports are fun and bubbly, yet realistic given the scenario. Serious conversations with Sigun / Thea on her join map. Add in a cute design and a cute support with Roy, and she's just so amazing. And I could not agree more. I love Shanna. She is one of my favorites. Not my number one favorite, but she is definitely up there for me as well. Definitely in my top 5, probably. I really, really like Shanna for all the same reasons that you listed. So, at Silent Irvin says, Deke, because I'm a sucker for Ogmas both in gameplay and story terms. His gladiator background and getting his scar from protecting Klein is so cool. And again, fully agree. I think Deke is a fantastic character. Again, one of my favorites. For, again, the same reasons that you listed. I think Deke is one of my favorite characters in the game in terms of gameplay. I like his story too, but I think in terms of gameplay, he's one of my favorite characters to use. I use him almost every playthrough. I didn't use him this time, but usually I do. And he's a lot of fun. I really like using him. And then finally, at Ufel says, it's gotta be Hugh. He is such a nice guy who wants to seem more cool than he is. He's kind, funny, and has his heart in the right place. He also has a unique gimmick that no other game has yet to replicate, tying gameplay and story into one. Alright, this is where I'll let the cat out of the bag, because my favorite character in the game is also Hugh. I love him so much. He's so funny. He's so wholesome. He's just the whole package. His gameplay gimmick is also a big factor as well. I think he's just a ton of fun to maybe not necessarily to use, but just conceptually, I really like him. Yeah, I mean, there's not really much else to say. That's kind of the downside of doing the whole SSS episode thing, is that when I get to stuff like this, I don't really have much else to say about Hugh that I haven't already said. If you want to hear my opinions on Hugh, go and listen to that SSS episode, because I lay out pretty extensively why I think Hugh is one of the best characters in the game. Well, I mean, in my opinion, he's the best character in the game, but hopefully after listening to that episode, you will agree with me. Okay, thank you for everybody who responded. I should mention Soup's favorite character. He kind of gave me 2. I asked him after we recorded, I was like, who's your favorite character, so I can talk about it in this little blurb. And he says it's kind of a toss-up for him between Roy, who we do talk about pretty extensively in this episode, so you'll get to hear plenty of his thoughts and my thoughts on Roy as a character. But then the other character who he kind of gave me was Lilina, for story reasons as well. I think he really likes Lilina's character, but I think another factor is the gameplay. He really likes using Lilina in gameplay. He uses her almost every playthrough, so from that perspective, I can also see why he's a big fan of her. So yeah, again, he mostly, I'm pretty sure he mostly was leaning towards Roy, but he said that Lilina was a great character as well. So yeah, go ahead and listen to the episode to get kind of our thoughts about Roy. And yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. Next time, I want to know from you guys, who is your favorite either set of Christmas calves or individual Christmas calves? Because we're going to be looking at Sane and Kent, who are probably my favorite Christmas calves in the series. Although there are some stiff competition in that field. The Christmas calves are very good. Maybe Oscar and Kieran are actually, I don't know. It's close. I really like both pairs. But yeah, just let me know who your guys' favorites are, either as a duo or like individual Christmas calves. Like if you like Sane but you don't really like Kent, or the other way around, like that's fine. You just let me know. Yeah. So I'm Amelia Kirby on Twitter. I'm not changing what I call it, at least not anytime soon. I'm stubborn like that. Or you can always email me at turnwheelpodcast@gmail.com. Yeah, so let me know your guys' thoughts, and I'll let you get back to the rest of the episode. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye. Hello and welcome to Melee's Turnwheel, the series that takes a retroactive look at the Fire Emblem series chapter by chapter. I'm your host, I'm in Melee Kirby, and today we are wrapping up Fire Emblem, The Binding Blade. And as promised, I'm once again joined by Super User Person. How you doing, Soup?
Doing pretty good. How about you?
I'm doing well. It's a fine Saturday afternoon, and it is a million billion degrees.
It was
Yeah,
actually, yeah, it is. It was actually raining for me a little bit earlier, and I was wondering, like, if we went during that time, we'd have some nice lightning as like ambient noise. It's like Bolting Lilina is right outside my building, judging me.
got the thunder tone, bro.
Yes.
All right. So, last time we talked about Endgame and kind of gave a lot of our thoughts on the final instances of this game's story, and I think today we're really just discussing how we feel about this game overall, and kind of what we think about it in relation to games that came before and after it. I've done this twice already. I don't know why I'm explaining it to you guys. I think you get the idea. So Soup and I just kind of had some points that we were gonna run through real quick and talk about in relation to how we feel about this game. So I think I talked a little bit about the context that this game came out in the first episode, but what I had completely neglected to mention, and in fact I didn't even remember until I think Soup, you were on talking about it at one point, was the context of this game being originally being for the N64, and then it got scrapped and refashioned into a handheld game. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So, like I've probably mentioned, and you've probably mentioned, this game is at an interesting point in Fire Emblem history. Specifically, this is the first game where the original creator Shozo Kaga was not working on it at all.
Yes.
So the specific timeline is, from what I understand, I'm pretty sure Fire Emblem Thracia, like Fire Emblem 5 Thracia 776, was being developed around at the same time as Fire Emblem 64. I believe it was kind of like a concurrent situation where Kaga intended to have Fire Emblem 5 as like kind of like the hardcore, like kind of like a side hardcore game for the people who've played like the older games like Arcania and Yggdrasil, and then Fire Emblem 64 would be like the new game that's really like exploring the N64's like kind of like trying to push the series forward, exploring N64's like technical prowess. Once like a week before FE5 came out, Kaga actually left the company. And I don't believe there is an official reason, but considering Fire Emblem 64 was being developed for the N64, and infamously absolutely great console for traditional RPGs, as shown by the great classic Quest 64.
So true. As shown by the Final Fantasy devs literally fucking off and switching to a whole new console architecture.
Yeah, so I believe that's the theory, is that Kago is kind of pulling a Square Enix and jumping ship to the PlayStation, considering right after he essentially created his own company and started work on Tearing Saga for the PlayStation.
And got sued.
Yeah, and got sued. It was this is a complete tangent, but he was kind of like out of pocket in the pre-release period.
It was originally called Emblem Saga, right?
Yeah, it was originally called Emblem Saga. The protagonist originally had blue hairs, and he was like in interviews.
And pronouns.
Yeah, he had blue hair and pronouns, just like everyone's favorite Marth Fire Emblem, who also has blue hair and pronouns. And they didn't even change the name from Emblem Saga to Tearing Saga until pre-orders closed. And during that pre-order window, he was apparently like going around like, I don't know, might be connected to the old Fire Emblem games. the characters from those games may appear, maybe not. I don't know. You just have to buy it and see.
What the
So
fuck?
yeah, it's not as like it's not as much of a what like ukulele, the bloodstain, Mighty
Oh
Number Nine
yeah.
scenario as people make it out to be. But I think it did set some precedent for that. But essentially, there was the one lawsuit they won, and then um, it actually got, I forget what, appealed, and then I think he lost the second lawsuit because of
Oh.
essentially what he was saying, like pre-release.
Yeah, no, that
Um,
tracks. It sounds pretty deserved, to be honest. If all that's true, I assume.
yeah. But like complete tangent. Essentially, the point is that Fire Emblem 64 was not like going to be like a feasible game to come out. Um, so post Kaga leaving, they pretty much had to start it back up from scratch. Um, and they decided to move it over to the GBA, which would have its own caveats. They would essentially try to take what they had for that game, and I believe they didn't really like take a lot. I don't think besides like a character named Roy and the idea of like like a dark priestess, which would I believe become like Idun. Um,
That
they
kind
also
of
had to like figure out how to make like a game that was traditionally a console game up to this point, like into a like handheld game for the GBA.
yeah, yeah. That would be a tough transitional thing for any series, even one that didn't have all that N64 baggage to come off of.
Hmm.
Um, I was gonna say in regards to the Dark Priestess thing, I that does feel true in the game because like if you maybe it's also like a language thing, but the whole Dark Priestess thing, like the identity of her as a priestess feels kind of like tacked on
Hmm.
because they don't like she doesn't present
It's
as
not
any
like
kind of like religious figure or anything.
yeah, it's kind of just like an excuse to keep her identity hidden for like
Hmm.
90% of the game.
That's true.
Uh,
Yeah. So I think all that kind of contributes to the game as we see it today. I mean, we've talked a few times about like how a lot of things may have been cut due to having to transition from the development of whatever the Fire Emblem 64 game was going to be to this new handheld game. I think, again, regardless of the transition from N64 to GBA, I think just taking any series built for console and transitioning it to a handheld system is going to necessitate a lot of streamlining, which is something I did talk about in that first episode. Kind of the necessary streamlining of mechanics to make the game a little bit more feasible to run, I guess, or accessible for a wider audience.
hmm Yep, and then there's also reason to believe it was on a pretty tight time frame since I believe they showed off Fire Emblem 64 in 2000, and then Binding Blade was supposed to come out in 2001. I think it got delayed to 2002. That's when it actually came out, but um, I forget if it got delayed or if it's just like, oh, Roy appeared in Smash, and I like the idea is that they would come out closer together at that point, but I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know the exact time frame, but there's reason to believe that they kind of had to do this, like all this reworking on a pretty tight time frame. Just from when the evidence of when we saw the old Fire Emblem 64 versus when this game actually came out. So I think there's reason to believe that this would be rushed.
Yeah.
Essentially, the idea that I want to essentially get to is that I think a lot of this is context for how the game turned out and why I think in retrospect it feels pretty bare bones because it feels like a lot of the focus is on defining like a Fire Emblem formula that they can use going forward with the series, like after Kaga departed. So with
Yes.
newer games, they can iterate and Kaga was definitely one for specifically I've heard it said it's like no matter what you can say no matter what you can basically say that Kaga like never made the same game twice except for that one time where he literally made Fire Emblem 1 again, but that doesn't count.
Even I mean I haven't played FE3, but even that seems kind of different.
Yeah, even like gameplay wise, FE3 is pretty substantially different from the way FE1 works.
Yeah,
but
you could argue they made FE1 again with this game too.
Oh, at this point, I'm talking specifically the games that Kaga made. Which,
okay, yeah. I was just
to be fair, Thracia isn't that much different than FE3, but like the capture pretty significantly changes things.
Yeah, like the introduction of new like map clear objectives like escape and survive also makes a difference, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yep, but this one definitely like leans a little bit more heavily in trying to define like a formula, and we can see that with later games where a lot of it like it feels pretty much the same as 6, but with some extra stuff tacked on. Like 7 is like kind of the same gameplay loop, but they tack on like more a lot more like modes. Yeah, extra story modes and like more
maps,
more map object. There's more maps and there's specifically more map objectives, so they play around with the map objectives a lot.
Yeah.
8 tries to like fold in some of the ideas from like say Gaiden, like the world map and extra battles.
A lot of different like new classes for like monsters and stuff.
Yeah, 9 uses 6 a lot as like a base, but then also has a lot of its own ideas, and so on and so on. But it kind of leaves 6 in like this kind of awkward middle child spot where it's kind of hard to define like what its unique thing is, especially compared to later games.
Yeah, and I think you can argue it doesn't have one, which I don't. Yes. I think you could also argue that that doesn't necessarily. It's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, like I mentioned before we started recording, I mentioned that it's kind of like an Ocarina of Time situation where Ocarina of Time has like this very distinct formula where you get 3 dungeons and then there's a big change in the world of the gameplay, and then you do 5 more dungeons and then you beat the game. And that's later games would iterate on that. I mean, even that in itself is kind of an iteration on the formula introduced in Link to the Past. But I think a lot of people still go back to Ocarina of Time and Link to the Past for their qualities, even if they're not necessarily unique qualities, but just they're good games, you know. And I think you can make the same argument for FE6 that it is a good iteration, a good first iteration, and one that brings a lot of quality to the table. That you know, I think I'm trying to think of how to word this. There are reasons to play FE6 over later games because in some ways FE6 is just did those ideas better. You know, it didn't try to stretch itself too thin, I don't think. It had the hard mode, which we'll get into later. But hard mode, FE6 hard mode is an experience unlike any other in the series, I would argue. Other than like FE12, I guess. But even those games, like the DS games, kind of substantially differentiate themselves from FE6 hard mode. So there are good reasons to play FE6, I think. And I'm sure you know, considering it's your favorite game in the series, obviously, I'm sure you have plenty as well.
Yep. So I agree with that. I like the comparison to essentially that era that is kind of like also an awkward middle child era for a lot of games when they were transitioning into 3D. Maybe like the comparison that I would make is maybe to like Mario 64, since that has less in common with the games that came before than Ocarina of Time does to like A Link to the Past.
That's true.
And like people still like Mario 64.
That's my favorite Mario game.
Yeah, even though like they do iterate on that concept a lot with Sunshine and Galaxy and especially Odyssey.
Yeah.
Um, but there is like a certain charm to one like the level design in 64. Like generally like a pretty good. It's generally like a pretty good crack at that. There's a lot of like iconic levels in there. Um, just like kind of the way Mario feels in that game. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
base, kind of like that without the clutter of like say the Flood,
Hmm.
where maybe that clutters his moveset a little bit too much. I
I
don't
think
have
the
as many.
gameplay,
Yeah, I don't really
the
have. Uh,
having played Odyssey, sorry, having played Odyssey, I think the main thing I would put 64 over Odyssey in regards to is I think the gameplay loop is a little bit more satisfying in the sense of like when you finish a level and collect a star, that like the game feel of that is like really good compared to Odyssey, which it just feels like they just throw a bunch of shit at you, which is not. I like Odyssey, but you're collecting like 10 moons in Odyssey never felt as satisfying as collecting one star in 64. Trying to see if you can get stars as fast as possible. Some stars in that game were as easy to get as some moons in Odyssey, but it just feels different. It's an inherently different kind of sensation while playing, and I think that is kind of what keeps me coming back to it. I played 64 a whole bunch of times, for I think that reason. Trying to see like what are some of the fastest stars you can get and some of the more challenging ones. I don't know. I like, as I said, I think 64 is probably my favorite Mario game, and I've played not that many, but a handful. So I can say that I think there are a lot of things that I like about 64 more than later games, despite those later games iterating on that same formula.
hmm
So
Yep.
evolution is not necessarily a good thing, which makes it sound like those later games are I'm not detracting from the later games at all. I just think there's merit in um, the pure distillation of those ideas.
Yep. What I was gonna say is I don't really have as many opinions on Mario as I do on the Fire Emblem series. So thank you for filling that in there.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
But yeah, essentially where I would go is I would say like FE6 kind of feels like that for me, where it's like it's kind of like the most basic ideas, but I think they're very well done here. And maybe like some of the later games, trying to expand upon that, maybe add a little bit of bloat. Um, I think personally I prefer like the handheld Fire Emblem experience to like a console experience um uh, like uh like Tellius and Three Houses are definitely like console games.
Hmm.
They're pretty different, but they are ostensibly console games. Same with like the Draw games.
Yeah,
They're meant to
Radiant
be like
Dawn.
sit yeah, they're meant to be sat down and played for a while. I like FE6 kind of introduces like the kind of like just sit down, play one chapter, and then be done with it, which I kind of prefer for
Yeah.
Fire Emblem. It's kind of just like being able to play in like bite-sized chunks.
Hmm.
Um,
I,
I
I
like kind
I'm
of just being able to like think about my run and then kind of execute it pretty quick.
Yeah, I think just to bounce off that real quick, something that I haven't had a chance to talk about since like the beginning of the game, but I think is a legitimately excellent gameplay innovation that kind of got moved away from later in the series is the whole auto saving every turn mechanic, which I think is obviously pretty necessary in the case of a handheld game, but I think you could argue that it's I mean I think it's good and should have stuck around for more than just that. I think it's only the GBA games that
I
have it,
mean,
right?
FE4 has it, but
Well, yeah,
it's
but
a different
it's a
kind of
different
auto
type.
saving. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like the GBA games autosave pretty much every move,
Yeah, that's
which
that's what I meant.
is nice for like a just shut off the game like when the bus stops or whatever.
Exactly.
Um, it is kind of annoying when like you pretty much like you get your lord killed and then you like try to go back and it's like, oh, I just gotta watch them die again and then go back to the title screen. They probably should just like automatically reset the chapter there.
Yeah, I would agree. But yeah, so yeah, I like that feature, and I kind of wish that they had kept it around. Although it has the FE4 system of saving at the beginning of every turn is maybe a little bit
It
more
makes more
consistent.
sense. Yeah, that makes more sense for like the resetting. But one thing I also want to bring up about six is like I've put a lot of stock into like it defining a Fire Emblem formula, but I feel like um and we kind of mentioned that like this is FE1 again. I think that this game kind of gets closer to the ideals of FE1 rather than a lot of the games that come after it. So I do like the Arcania games a lot, and I like a lot of the ideas
You,
that it has that doesn't
I
really
don't.
come up later.
It probably picked up on your Audacity, but you cut out for a minute there for me.
Okay.
I heard you say it comes close to representing the ideals of FE1 more than any other game after.
Yeah, probably closer to FE3 actually, but there's a lot of things that six has that a lot of later games move away from. Like it's probably one of the more Iron Manable games. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
the characters are, even with supports, a lot of the characters are relatively blank slates.
Yeah.
Which we'll probably get into when we talk about the support system a little bit later. But um, the which is kind of with the difficulty is kind of a factor in that, but that kind of dampens it. But I think like I like it as kind of like a little bit more streamlined FE1 or 3.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I don't know, whatever the opposite of streamlined is, that's what FE1 is. FE1 was, I cannot fucking believe that I actually made it all the way through that game. That was a fucking mess. FE3 I can't speak to, but you know, I agree with what you're saying. I think FE6 is definitely a lot more streamlined.
okay, a little bit more streamlined FE11.
Uh yeah, I mean
Even
I
though
think
like FE11 is decently streamlined, but a little bit more cut down so that it doesn't really have the. I mean, it's kind of weird because like six was first. I'm talking like I don't really have to consider forging or
mhm.
class changes, which would be
Yeah.
11 and 12's unique things.
Yeah. Definitely. I
Um,
get what you're saying.
which facilitates harder modes, but I think I just think it's like a good um essentially like it's a pretty basic uses formula, kind of the most simple mechanics. The mechanics that are there though, I have a lot of fun with, like the rescue mechanic.
Yeah.
Um the
Rescue
it
mechanic is good.
Yeah, and um I think that the difficulty balance on both normal and hard like it's pretty solid. Normal
Hmm.
more so than hard, which we'll get to.
Yeah,
But
we have a whole probably have like a whole half hour chunk dedicated to talking about hard mode.
yeah, but yeah, even on normal, I just like the way that it decides to challenge you, specifically like with the
Mhm.
true end requirements,
Yeah.
having like specific turn limits, and map design generally pretty decent. Besides the guidance chapters, but I think they do a good job of like actually trying like pushing you to be aggressive.
Yes, I would
Um,
agree.
so it's just kind of like simple and like a good challenge is kind of what I think about this game. And also just because it is kind of like this interesting transition point for the series, um, it kind of makes me appreciate it a little bit more than say some of the later games that I also think are pretty well streamlined, like Tellius and like Engage.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that that's a very good way of summing up this game's appeal. You know, I think it's simple, it's streamlined, it doesn't have a whole lot of extra fluff,
Mm-hmm.
and the balance. You know, it has some. I think putting it mildly, it has some balance issues, but I think it's in some ways it is, it's better balanced than a lot of other games, because it does actually challenge you more so than I would say FE7 or 8 do at any point.
It's more a difficulty balance rather than a unit balance, which we'll get to.
Yes.
Which, essentially, like, it's kind of in that realm where, like, your busted units aren't that busted. They're not, like, they're not as juggernauty as some of the other games.
Yeah, there are no Robins or Seths in this game.
Yeah, it's more like I think I've made the comparison to Smash Bros. Melee before, where it's like the top tiers are, like, pretty well balanced within themselves, but like after like mid and lower, like just like dumpster trash, like just not balanced at all.
I can speak from personal experience about how difficult it is to utilize certain low tier characters in Super Smash Bros. Melee.
Yes. Funny comparison because it's Roy's fault both times.
It's true. But yeah, no, I think unit balance is definitely distinct from like map difficulty balance, and like game design balance, which I think is what you're alluding to more. And I think that the game design balance is good. We can spend more. We kind of have like a few different directions that we want to go. So I think we'll come back to that more later. For now, I think I want to shift focus to the support system, because this is kind of like a narrative and a gameplay adjustment at the same time, which I think is kind of cool, or at least interesting to talk about. So the support system, just a recap in case anybody isn't, forgets how it works, it hasn't played the older games in a while. The way the support system works is that every character will have a certain number of other characters that they can have conversations with. And the way that you develop those relationships and unlock those conversations is by having those two characters stand next to each other for, in this game, a really long time before they'll unlock like support level C, and then after a certain number of turns next to each other, they'll unlock support level B by grinding those support points. And every support rank gives you bonuses that are tied to your affinities. There's a whole chart you can look up. We don't have to get into it here, but every character has a certain number of affinities, or there are a certain number of affinities in the game, and every character has one that'll determine how the supports influence each other in gameplay. This is actually, the gameplay side of it was introduced in FE5 kind of, where every character had like certain characters that they would give bonuses to when they're nearby. But the innovation that this game kind of put on that system is that in addition to the gameplay bonuses, you would also get little conversations between the characters that would help flesh them out a little bit. To varying degrees of success, but I guess we'll get into that. In general, how do you feel about the support system, just in a vacuum?
Yep. Like that is kind of the major innovation. So this is probably the first time in the podcast you talk about the support system, at least as it exists in the modern context, and not like 4 or 5 where it's pretty much just the bonus.
Yeah.
There's as a whole, I know there's some back and forth on like, is the support system actually good for these games? It kind of like pigeonholes characterization beyond, like, as kind of a bonus rather than like the forefront. So a lot of it is like, oh, you pretty much like don't get context on a character unless you actually go out of your way to view the context. So you kind of miss a lot of characterization for characters you might like, just if they don't give a good initial first impression. Which kind of leads to a lot of debates like within the fandom. Is like, oh, is this character good? This character sucks. I like that as the idea. I like the replayability aspect where it's like, oh, I can dig into characters more. I can dig into a character more if I like them. I like the support system when it's implemented more as like a bonus. Like, everyone raves about base conversations in like 9 and 10 for good reasons. Specific, like, I think that does like have that does do a good job of like kind of giving characters context, like giving characters the opportunity to kind of give their personality in a story context rather than like kind of having that be hidden behind supports. And that's kind of also a problem with supports, is that they kind of have to be written to be viewable at any point in the story. There's some later where like in some of the later games they do lock some supports behind major gameplay, like major shifts in status quo. Like specifically Three Houses is pretty bad about this. Three Houses kind of almost is the opposite, where it's like, oh, you can lock yourself out of support by not doing it early enough, which is like a completely different problem. But
FE9 does this very well, where certain supports won't unlock until a certain story event has happened.
In the story.
Some things can. You can kind of... They don't capitalize on this very well in most cases, but especially at characters you know join after a certain point, they can reference events that will always happen before they join. Or if you know that there's a character, like say a character joins in chapter 12, and you know the earliest you'll be able to get that A support is chapter 14 or whatever. They can incorporate that a little bit, but they don't. It's pretty narrow, and they don't even do that much usually. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a system. Obviously, later games would introduce supplements to this system, which we can. I don't want to get too deep into, but we can briefly talk, I guess, about like support base conversations and things like that, which I think
basically I just brought them up to say that I like the support system when it's more of a supplement to other systems of delivering characterization and not kind of like the only way. At least from a characterization standpoint. From a mechanical standpoint, this might be getting into more how this game does supports versus other, like how the GBA games do support versus the other games in the series. I guess I actually kind of want to turn this over to you. How do you feel about GBA supports locking, I guess GBA and FE9 supports technically locking you to a limit of I believe 5 supports total versus later games where you can support anyone you want?
So I think, to play devil's advocate, I think it can and actually has been used to good effect in some cases. I think so. For an example from FE7, I can't think of a good example from this game, to be honest, but as an example from FE7, actually I can think of a couple, but we'll start with the FE7 one. I'm not going to take credit for this, what's the word? This observation, because I got it from a series of Reddit posts made by one Lack of Interest, where he examined some FE7 supports. And the one that he drew attention to, and that's relevant here, is the Kent Insane support, I believe it was, where their A support talks about how Kent got shot down by Lynn after like confessing her feelings to him, as opposed to his Kent's A support with Lynn, where they end up in a relationship together. So in that sense, it's kind of creating two alternative possibilities that are mutually exclusive from each other, and using that to good narrative effect, where it's like you get to decide whether he ends up with Lynn or whether he gets shot down. And that kind of, knowing the game, being aware that those ideas are mutually exclusive, is utilized in that sense.
It's kind of that's kind of like the version in this game of the Marcus Lilina support, where the A support is basically him encouraging Lilina to like pursue Roy, even though she literally can't because she already has an A support at that point. It kind of feels like the self-aware version of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, in that sense. I also think the example that I was gonna pull from this game, is the Ray. I think is a perfect example because
Mm-hmm.
Ray. I talk a little bit about this in the episode where I talk about his supports. He has like multiple different supports with multiple different characters, and it's almost like you're picking the path that he chooses to pursue, because in some of his supports he does lean more towards that edgy side of himself and actually pursues dark magic. Whereas, I mean, the end. This is kind of a different thing, but like the ending doesn't change, which is a shame. I wish more paired endings existed in this game, but
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to like his Lou and Chad supports, where he kind of like pulls himself out of that mentality and returns more to his older self and his kinder self, and moves away from the dark magic stuff. So kind of understanding that A supports are mutually exclusive, the game is able to create a scenario where sometimes Ray will, get an A support with Nime and become a dark magic scholar, or get an A support with Lou and go back and live in peace
Mm-hmm.
with his family. So in that sense, I think it's kind of cool. Now I'm done being devil's advocate because I think everything else about it sucks. This is a
Yeah.
terrible idea.
Yeah. The obvious point is that it's kind of antithetical to the idea of supports, where it's like, oh, I like this character, I want to know more about them. Well, you can't see everything about them in one playthrough. You have to use them like in a ton of different playthroughs. So it kind of feels designed in like that old school game design way of like, we're essentially going to design this game so that they have to play it like multiple different times so they actually get their money's worth out of this.
Hmm.
Um, Versus now where it's like you just have like infinity long game instead. Um, but I like it's kind of weird because kind of what supports are now is essentially, since you can support everyone, a lot of conversations kind of overlap. So you have like the problem of like a character going through a character arc and then going to the next support and like just reverting back to like their original gimmick, which is like a critique that's leveraged against like games like Awakening and Fates and Engage to an extent. Um,
Hmm.
I think of the two, I would prefer just getting pretty much any support that you want, um,
Yeah.
and then having them try to kind of make the supports as distinct as possible. Essentially, just try to. And part of the problem with like Awakening and Fate specifically is that since marriage was the thing, they kind of had to do everyone supports everyone, just for gameplay reasons. So they had to just like make up whatever for the support. I like it a little bit better in Engage, where they can pick and choose. Like, oh, these characters would actually kind of go well together, so they can have a conversation. It feels a little bit more fresh there. My problem with some of the later supports is actually more from a gameplay perspective, where I like the GBA, like there being some strategy to who you support with who.
Yeah.
Um, and like the bonuses you get actually feel pretty significant, like especially in this game. The Wrecker supports are infamous for
Hmm.
specifically like the Wrecker, Clarine, Deke,
Triangle. Yeah.
Triangle, where he gets over 100% crit. I like there being some strategy, and like that's kind of where the affinities come into place. Where it's like I like there being some strategy to there being like who you support with who, beyond just the story perspective.
Yeah.
What I'm surprised, the compromise I'm surprised they've never tried before is essentially like having you be able to support whoever you want, like the newer games, but essentially you can only have 5 active supports at a time, or you can only have um, the support line with like 3 characters at once, like actually be active and give bonuses. Some of the
Yeah.
later games, like like especially like this is kind of a problem, especially with Three Houses, where the support bonuses are pretty much like negligible, like you wouldn't notice them at all. especially beyond the early game. Um, I like it being like kind of a long term strategy thing. So I'm surprised they've never done like I said, just like choose who you get the bonuses from, but you can support anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that would be a better system. I think that the series has always struggled with the support system being both a narrative and a gameplay mechanic.
Uh huh.
Whereas I think in part of the reason why I think base conversations and things like that succeed is because they are able to focus strictly on
Mm-hmm.
the narrative side of things, without any influence on the gameplay. Not to say that I think that supports should completely cut the gameplay aspect or focus entirely on the gameplay aspect. I just think that it's something that they it's not I want to say it's an inherent limitation. I do think it is a limitation that they had to work around. I just don't know why they haven't. you know
Right.
it seems like something that they probably should have figured out by now, all these games later, over 10 games after they were
Mm-hmm.
introduced.
Yeah, and this might be the problem with six establishing the formula is that maybe, and it's not that I don't feel like they've like sufficiently kind of questioned the formula enough. I especially like after Three Houses, I think like, oh, they're definitely willing to kind of go pretty radically away from the formula, but for whatever reason, supports have remained relatively static beyond just them going like, okay, you can just support whoever you want.
Yeah, I think when you have a game with a cast as huge as this,
Hmm.
in most games, unless you're talking about like Pokemon,
Hmm.
40 plus playable characters is like a lot.
Yes.
That all have to have like unique faces and identities.
Hmm.
So I think the support system is for the time, I think it was genuinely the best that they could manage.
Yeah.
And I think that in the if we're just talking about the context of this game, I think it was fine.
Yep.
I'm glad they introduced it. I think it was better than nothing, and I think that legitimately nothing was the only alternative. But nowadays, I think it is weird that they haven't broken past that and
Hmm.
added more to that. Basically, I guess.
I mean, they kind of have. They kind of haven't. They haven't really committed to like a
Yeah.
consistent way of doing that. Like the closest is like, essentially kind of like what would be considered the new form of base conversations, where you have like your hub, and then you can just walk up to whoever. Three Houses does that a lot better than Engage. Engage is kind of like nothing with it.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
in Three Houses, it's kind of uh, like it's interesting, but they also commit to having everyone say something for every chapter, which like it makes it really tedious to go through.
But it's all I'm not gonna. I like Three Houses, and I am frequently surrounded by spaces that do not like Three Houses. So maybe I'm a bit quick to jump to Three Houses' defense. But I do think, like, unless you're like a
Like a
serious,
scraper.
yeah, like you need to be a crazy level of completionist to like feel like you need to do that every chapter. Like
Hmm.
I play the Legend of Heroes Trails series, and that series is infamous for its NPC sweeps. And even I know I bring up Trails a lot, but it's relevant here, I promise. Even I would not feel like that's necessary. You know what I mean? Like I think it's a nice addition. Maybe there should be like a place where you
Uh-huh.
can. I think that,
I
that's
wouldn't.
where the fan works come in, and have a place where you can just read it
Yeah,
all.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't argue with cutting it. The problem is that like, even if I'm like at a certain point, I'm just like, okay, I don't need to read this all. But something in the back of my mind goes, but what if this character says something really cool here?
And sometimes they do.
And
Like
sometimes they do.
it's kind of become a meme, but like the whole "we killed Ferdy Professor"
Yeah.
thing is like legitimately one of the best moments in the game, and it's completely missable if you. Not only is it missable if you don't talk to her in the monastery or whatever, but it's also missable if you don't have Dorothea on your team and Ferdy on the other team. You know,
Right.
there's like a crazy amount of missable dialogue in later games, which honestly I think is kind of cool because it makes it so that everybody will have kind of a unique gameplay experience.
Hmm.
Because not everybody is going to get that conversation.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah, I
it's
mean, granted, like we're also talking about supports and like limiting them, so it's kind of the same idea. Where like supports kind of the same idea. You're not gonna see every support in every run, no matter what you
Mhm.
do.
Yeah, I think ultimately if they had stuck, I think the 5 support limit is frustrating, but I can live with it. And I think
Hmm.
again, it's one of those things where it's like it sucks that you can't see it all in game,
Hmm.
but you can always just go look it up online. And I think a
Yeah,
lot of games are just like that
and
sometimes.
what we haven't touched on is you probably will look them up online because good luck getting the
Yes,
supports in this game.
it takes so long, and this is
Yeah.
more of an FE6 specific issue because the 7 and 8 aren't quite as bad. They can be tedious sometimes, but 6 is like so slow to get any support that is not Roy Lilina. Roy
Uh-huh.
Lilina is like crazy, crazy fast, and then everything else is like takes you like
Yeah, it's slow, and they also cap you at a certain support number of I think they cap the number of support points you can get per chapter.
that's so stupid. They
It
really
is
should not.
stupid, yeah.
I think that they might
Um
have even scrapped that in FE7, although maybe it's just because the number of support points you need is lower. But I feel like in FE7, if I really, really wanted
mhm.
to, I could just like grind out support
Yeah,
points every chapter.
I don't know that for sure, but I mean I think the only limitation is that you can't like raise someone's support twice, like the same support
Yeah,
chain twice in the same chapter, but I'm not sure if
I,
I'm pretty sure 6 like actively like limits the amount of support points you get period per chapter.
mhm. If you haven't noticed, I have a tendency of wildly speculating based on how things feel and then not fact checking.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to fact check with
That's
Japanese
true.
media. They're not going to talk about that ever. They Jap I'm not sure if it's like a cultural thing, but like or like the like a cultural Japanese need to be like professional, which is also something I'm not fact checking a lot here. But I mean, like with the Japanese media, they pretty rarely talk about behind the scenes stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's just one of those things where we're never really gonna know unless you like test it, and who has time for that, honestly.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I think supports overall. I mean, obviously, I don't think it goes without saying that it was a good addition. It's just a matter of like how well were they executed
Uh huh.
and how later games executed on them better, which I think
Hmm.
when I phrase it like that, it feels like maybe we didn't need to spend this long talking about them because it was a pretty slam dunk. But
Uh huh.
it was still worth talking about. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it's the first time we can talk about it in the series, and probably will
Yeah.
be the basis for other games. It's like, well, the support system, but it's not FE6's support system. Like it does
Yeah.
feel very much like a first stab at this, which
Sure.
you kind of
Yeah.
gotta respect it for coming up with the idea. But it's not implemented the best here.
I think the only thing I'd add is you mentioned pigeonholing earlier, which I think is a valid concern. Um, and we see that there's a lot of games again that focus on like large casts of characters that have this problem where it's like, yes, it would be better if we were getting story content for all these guys, but in a realistic sense, it's
Hmm.
just not going to happen. I think the closest we'll ever come is like Tellius style
Hmm.
based conversations. Um, and the Three Houses Monastery is probably the closest that we've gotten to all of them. Three Houses in general, because it can focus on, instead of focusing on all 50 characters or whatever, it can focus on 12 at a time. I
Hmm.
think that game does a fantastic job of making the characters relevant to the story, even if there are a lot of scenes where they'll just kind of like say the same thing.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the main problem, and one that's like going to be like kind of just a problem just because of the legacy of the series, and it's been a debate on whether like permadeath is necessary within the series because it kind of makes it so that like if any character can die, then you also got to write the story so that it makes sense with X character being dead beyond like the main characters that can't die.
Yeah.
And like even Three Houses kind of falls into this. Even like characters do show up. Specifically, like the characters within the house you pick show up in the cutscenes to like to show off their character, but it kind of mostly amounts to like them standing in a circle and then just like saying off their character gimmick.
Yeah.
Like
For sure.
Their contribution is kind of still meant to be replaceable, or not important enough to say it, but it does at least feel like they're present and contributing in some way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a little bit generic, but it's something. Oh, you said something that like fired a synapse in my brain and it's just gone. What did you just say before?
It's about permadeath specifically, or something before
Yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah. I was gonna shill Tellius because I'm a huge Tellius stan. But Tellius FE9 specifically accounts for character death in the story writing, which is just like insane to me that like considering the standard that the entire rest of the series sets, is wild to me. You know, like I think it kind of falls off as the game goes on, but especially in the early game, you know, the Grail Mercenaries, if Oscar dies, there's like cutscenes that reference that, you know, and like it affects later dialogue. It's not anything extensive, but it feels like the game is way more dynamic than other games are allowed to be, you know?
Yep, and that's the best way around it, but that's also much easier said than done, especially as the scope increases. It's like, well, like how, like once you have like an army of like 50, like how can we account for like a specific character being dead?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think even just doing it at the beginning of the game, I think is better than kind of, you know, it feels inconsistent, but it also, you know, it's better than nothing in my opinion. But
6 has a couple of those, like if Lulina dies in 8X, there's specific dialogue, but it doesn't really affect much of the rest of the game.
Yeah, unfortunately. But,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and all the plot relevant characters are immune to death. Obviously, like Merlinus and Guinevere isn't a playable character. So I mean, maybe that's why they didn't make Guinevere a playable character, because if she died, then what the fuck were they gonna do? Just be like, oh well, Burns. I mean, they probably could have put in one cutscene, but maybe they didn't want to bother.
She'd probably just need to be one of those characters that just like retreats.
Retreats, yeah. I don't know if there are any of those in FE6 besides Merlinus, obviously.
6, well, Merlinus is a special case because even when he dies, he doesn't really die.
Yeah, he comes back. He's not like permanently injured or anything.
Yeah.
So maybe they just hadn't thought of that idea yet.
Probably. I'm trying to. Does 4 must do that in some way?
4, I think. Well, no, because the moms don't have to be alive. If they die, you just get the substitutes.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe.
I mean, what happens if, like, say, Quan dies before?
Yeah. Okay.
Chapter 5?
He retreats. So does Ethlyn and Finn.
Yeah.
Quan and Ethlyn retreat together. If one of them dies, then they both leave. And then I think Lewin probably also doesn't die. I don't know though. I haven't tested that. I mean, yeah, it's hugely important that he doesn't die, so I assume he doesn't. But yeah, so.
Ironically, because like, if he died, he could
you know,
it could just bullshit it. So like, oh, Zed took him over like at that moment.
Yeah. But yeah, so overall, I think the support system is a good one. Obviously, with its huge limitations some of which have been addressed, some of them haven't. But overall, I think it's a positive change for the series and one that I'm glad they kept moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay.
So the next topic here that I have for us is the introduction. This is the first game where there's like an actual dedicated hard mode. Like before, there was kind of specifically like with FE4, there was like the smart AI mode where it's really the same game, but like the enemies just won't attack you if like they know they can't win or something.
Yeah, there's
Something
like
like that.
some weird nebulous changes that happen.
So yeah, most of the different modes or stuff like that, and stuff like Paragon modes,
Yeah, there's
to
easy
essentially
modes in some
change the
games.
difficulties.
Yeah.
But it's less like the actual like game and like enemy stats are changing, more so that there's like some specific advantage or disadvantage that you're given. This is the first game with like a dedicated hard mode, and that is something that like difficulty modes pretty much become a staple in the series after that. Like every game after has like an easy and hard mode, like an easier and a harder mode, at the very least.
Yes.
So
So
I think it's interesting to talk about like how this kind of set the course for difficulty modes in the series.
yeah, and I think to give a little context on our different perspectives here, I played normal mode for my playthrough, and you played hard mode. And you have played hard mode. This was not your first hard mode playthrough, I don't believe.
It actually was, yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. All right. I did try at one point. I started a hard mode playthrough just because we were talking about FE6 and I wanted to check it out. And I made it to chapter 5, I think, before I just gave up because I do not vibe with hard mode very much in this game. You kind of talk, I guess. You want to talk about what are your overall thoughts on hard mode? I guess because I want to hear from you.
My opinion was like, I was also under the assumption that like hard mode was just like, it's like not like kind of not for me, not super fun. But I think the worst of it is in the early game. Like generally, especially like most Fire Emblem games, like the hardest stuff is going to be in the hard mode just because of the way these games are designed.
You mean the early game?
Yeah, the early game is like super restrictive, but you're going just by playing well, you're just gonna get better and better resources, so you'll have like a better time taking it on a little bit later. But like the early game is definitely not well designed in this game. Like I think one of the hardest turns is literally like map 1, turn 1. Like for whatever reason that is just like impossibly hard and will 100% turn you off of hard mode, just like literally right off the bat. It kind of feels like you have to like super turtle and like there's like nothing you can do, which kind of makes it feel like a impossible mode. But I think like the first 7 chapters, like through chapter 7, is kind of like it kind of has this problem that a lot of later Fire Emblem games also have. Like I think pretty much all Fire Emblem games have this problem. Is that the early game is going to feel super homogenous, especially on hard mode. It's like there feels like there's very little variance in what you can actually do, since you haven't really gotten the ability to get up and running strategy-wise.
Yeah.
So it feels like you're super railroaded. It kind of feels almost puzzle gamey, where you have to kind of use specific units for a specific purpose. And there's something to be said about the specific way that FE6 balances its hard mode specifically, which I think led to a lot of very bad habits in hard mode balancing going forward, where essentially just the way they did hard mode is they essentially said, okay, we're going to increase these enemies' levels by X number, depending on the map. For whatever reason, the early game, like, they pretty much did it, like, 2 times what it should be. So it's like, they would get, like, 2 levels higher instead they get, like, 4 levels higher. So it really feels unfair, especially for the enemies that are bulkier and normal, like the Cavaliers.
Oh,
like,
God.
they just feel, like, impossibly bulky in, say, like,
Wyverns.
Chapter 4. Like, it was, Chapter 4 is maybe, yeah, and Wyverns too. Like, Chapter 4 was maybe, like, probably the biggest reality check for hard mode versus normal mode for me. Because I was like, Oh, everyone complains about chapter 4, but it's not really that hard. Like it's not it's pretty like like it's pretty reasonable. I think it's
Yeah.
pretty reasonable to get like it's pretty easy to control by the time shows up. But in hard mode, it's like, oh my god, these Cavaliers are like impossibly bulky. You like really have to turtle this map. And
Mercenaries are like impossible to double.
yeah, mercenaries are a problem. Swordmasters are definitely a
Oh
problem.
God.
It's especially if you're. I think by the mid and late game, it kind of balances itself out. Um, where it's like, especially if you're using like the designated good units, then like I feel like it's a pretty reasonable challenge still.
Mm-hmm.
But the early game really, really suffers from just them going blanket, like, okay, we're gonna increase them by X number of levels. Like, in the early game, they probably shouldn't have done that.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
this, like I said, the way they balance FE6's hard mode, I think, kind of have negative effects for how they go about hard modes in later games, where pretty much their solution to designing a hard mode is essentially just like, okay, let's just inflate enemy stats
Yes.
by like X number, and then just go for it. Which like is they still do that in like newer games like Three Houses and Engage, which is like
Oh God.
yeah, I
Yeah, they
that's
do it pretty
generally like
badly.
a bad habit of theirs, and I feel like it's fair to blame FE6 for kind of starting off that trend.
Mm-hmm.
I get why it works like that in this game. It would be kind of like we talked about why this game was on like kind of a tight time frame, and I imagine if something in their early design, if hard mode was in their early design docs, I can imagine they would be like had higher ambitions for it, but then like kind of just had to be like, okay, we just got to find the quickest solution, and the quickest solution is basically like basically make an AI generated mode kind of
Yeah, literally.
where they're just like, okay, just pump up the stats by X number.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think you can kind of see it. You can kind of see why it was kind of like a pretty rushed thing. By the way hard mode bonuses work. Specifically
Yes.
where it's like the reason why hard mode bonuses exist is because um, the algorithm that they run, it seems like they wanted it to specifically only affect enemy units, but they only run the check to not give like units that you can recruit the extra stats on. They only run that when like they first load up the map. So any units that are um, spawned on the map in the first place, like
Yeah, like, you can
Ray
see on the prep screen Ray,
yeah, like
Chapter
Ray for
13
example,
Percival.
yeah, Chapter 13 Percival. Um, they don't get the hard mode bonuses, but if they join after the map, then they still like get that hard mode formula.
Milady being an infamous example. She's never an enemy, but because she shows up as a red unit for a cutscene, they apply that formula to her, and she gets cracked bases.
Yeah, so there's reason to believe they didn't really test it too much.
Yes.
Um,
Now, in to a certain extent, I definitely think it was a glitch in this game, or maybe like an oversight, I guess. But in later games, they do actually bring it back as like a proper mechanic because FE7 characters get hardware bonuses like Guy and Raven.
hmm
But in this one, I think it's pretty safe to say that they did not intend for that to be. I mean, I guess the other way you can look at it is maybe it was unintentional for characters like Ray and Chapter 13 Percival to not get the bonuses, but I think that's way less likely.
I mean, it could be a little bit bad faith to just assume that, but I feel like there's enough evidence to make that assumption. Like if any FE6 dev wants to DM me and prove me wrong, I will learn Japanese so that I can talk with you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a safe conclusion to reach. I mean, like you said, there's no way to really know because of how poorly documented a lot of this stuff is. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, we can only infer, and I think I'm inferring that it is an oversight that the characters like Fur and Milady and
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 15 Percival all get these bonuses.
Yeah. So essentially, just my thoughts is that I think I think six's hard mode is like I like it, but it's mostly it's I mostly kind of like it just based on the strength of the original game. Like I don't really super agree with the way that it goes about its hard mode.
Yeah.
And it kind of paves the way for some of the sins in the later games where the hard mode and especially like the hardest like lunatic modes make enemies way too bulky.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you can see in 6 as well, is that some of the enemies are like way too bulky. Where it
Yes.
kind of just doesn't make the game harder, it just makes it more tedious.
Yep.
In this game, I think like the units that you get are balanced enough so it doesn't really feel that way. But later games, when characters are a little bit more powerful, then it does kind of just make it like an immovable object versus a movable object. You're just gonna take like forever to make your way through a map. I think the best way they've gone about it is 11 and 12 hard modes where it feels like they pretty much just inflate the offensive stats of the enemy, kind of making it more dangerous, but
Cutting down on the tedium.
yeah, cutting down on like the tedium. So it's like you can kill the enemies pretty fast, but they can also kill you pretty fast, so you don't want to make mistakes.
You said for like the DS games?
Yeah, for the DS
Yeah.
games specifically, use that a little bit more. Like,
Mhm.
granted, the hardest difficulties on the DS games are also like
Yeah.
insane people difficulty.
Like the first 3
Um,
maps of Shadow Dragon are just like comically stupid.
Yeah, that's also kind of like I think it's still blanketly applied. So the early game is still like stupid, but once it gets going, it's fun.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the thing that FE12 in particular really excels at this, and you can kind of see them do this in other games. I think specifically FE7, I've seen this, but there may be other ones as well. Where on hard mode, in FE12's case, like progressively higher difficulty levels, they will limit you in other ways. In some cases, and specifically
Right.
The way that it restricts items that you can get. Like FE12 does not give you the warp step on certain difficulty levels, or the silver card, or like certain money options. And FE7 I think changes some stat boosters and some promotion items. That's a little bit trickier too, because that sometimes changes between Eliwood and Hector mode. But I think sometimes it is also a difference between like Eliwood normal mode and Eliwood hard mode, and then also Hector normal mode and Hector hard mode. So
Yeah. Granted,
I prefer. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, finish your thought.
I was just gonna say I prefer that system overall because I think it's more interesting than just giving enemies bulky
Kind
stats.
of, but I also that kind of led me down the thought path where it's like I just remembered another one of 6 hard modes bad habits that permeated through the rest of the series, which is essentially just like limiting mechanics from you, like how 6 does not let you use the in prep screen shop in hard mode specifically, which I'm like, I don't like them limiting options that you have on easier difficulties. I think specifically like mechanically, I think it's fine if like they give you like less stat boosters maybe. But I think limiting like FE12 completely just removing the option to use warp staffs and say like FE10 hard mode like doesn't let you use
And the weapon triangle.
no weapon triangle and no enemy ranges for some reason.
That's stupid.
Like,
I
that
agree
is
with that
stupid.
one.
I don't really like them like actively taking mechanics away from you.
I think I would draw a distinction there personally between like the warp staff versus the in-game shop, right? Because I think one of those is a quality of life feature, and the same with the Radiant Dawn ranges, right? Like I think that's just a basic quality of life feature that doesn't really, I don't think it makes the game that much easier. It just means that you have to like be constantly checking, like counting squares, and that's just boring. That doesn't
Yeah.
feel like it makes the game hard in like a meaningful way. Whereas I think removing the warp staff, I think, is a more meaningful choice because, I mean, we all know how fucking broken the warp staff can be, and I don't think like
It's a little bit more nuanced than the 10 thing, but I think there's a difference between, say, like, if normal mode gave you 3 warp staffs and then hard mode gave you 1, that'd be one thing, but just
that's
completely
fair.
removing the mechanic, I think is um, a little bit, I don't know, it's not necessarily unfair because warp is a pretty, like, busted strategy, but I feel like just having, like, a strategy that you can rely on in normal mode that you can't in hard mode is, like, normal mode should kind of, like, teach you how to play the game, which, or at least kind of be, like, an easier environment. I don't think, like, this strategy should significantly change beyond, like, maybe being tighter with resources.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think limiting, like having only giving you one warp staff, I think would actually be a very good compromise. That's a very good point. I think that they saw, because if you ever see like anyone play higher difficulties of FE11, it's like the first 3 maps are comically stupid, but then as soon as you get the warp staff, it's just like game over. Basically, like
Yep.
you barely have to play the game anymore after that point.
Yeah.
I think they were just trying to avoid one of those situations, but I can see, I think it would have been better if they had just been limited rather than completely cut out.
Yep. And I think there was only one in 12's case for, so I think the only way they can cut it is by
Getting rid of it entirely.
getting rid of it entirely, but actually I'm not 100% sure on that, but maybe
I don't
the
remember
better
either.
solution would be to give more warp staffs in normal mode more so than remove them entirely from hard mode, but
Perhaps.
it is a little bit more nuanced than just like what 6 or 10 is doing, where they just gut a mechanic entirely that doesn't really make the game that much easier.
Mm-hmm. This would be kind of deranged, but you know how different games have like different ranges for the warp staff. Like in this game, it's your magic. In some games, it's infinite, and then in some games, it's magic divided by half. And so I think even in some games, it's magic divided by 4. I think maybe that could be interesting. Like it kind of scales with the difficulty. Like normal mode, it's infinite. Hard mode, it's like your magic range, and then lunatic, it's your magic cut in half. That could be interesting.
Maybe I would. I'm fine. I would. It makes sense for the infinite warp range because the infinite warp range is like actually busted. I think a version of like 12 where you could use the warp staff on higher difficulties, but the range is limited would be interesting. I don't know about how I feel about like varying the range, like cutting the range in half, and like scaling that up based on higher difficulties.
Well, I mean, I think magic divided by 2 is kind of like, I don't want to say the standard, but that's what they do in 7 and 8. So, and I think that that's like pretty well balanced. It's still useful, but it's not like in this game, you can use it to skip entire maps, which I think is, I mean, a blessing. In the case of 14x and 16x. But I think magic, I think it being equal to your magic stat is maybe still a little bit too good.
Yeah, that's fair, but I think that's kind of where the one warp staff comes in because you kind of gotta pick and choose what maps you actually warp skip.
That's true.
Granted, you could also have the hammer and go in to essentially triple your usage, but
Yeah.
or quadruple.
It's I think an interesting way of balancing that is what Thracia did, where like if you look at FE6, like what else other than I guess the holy weapons are you using hammering on? Like there's basically nothing else that's worth hammering in FE6. Unless you like really want to kill a bunch of wyverns with fucking Durandal in the mid game, but other than that, it's like there's really no point. Whereas I think introducing some like good unique weapons. What I think FE11 kind of does this with like forges and stuff too, where it's like there's like legitimately different options to spend the hammer on. Could be good.
That's kind of a consequence of 6's like pretty limited weapon and item pools.
Yeah, that's true. All right.
I think probably move on.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, do you have anything? I feel like I had less.
I've said my piece about hard mode.
I felt like I had less to say about it than I expected to be honest. I mean, part of that is that I haven't played it more than a few chapters, but yeah, I think it's this is not like the support system. I don't think where it's like other than 12, which has its own problems. I think this hasn't really been iterated on in a lot of meaningful ways, and I think it still has a lot of the same problems that it had from the beginning.
Oh yeah, they've pretty much not done much. I think the funniest one this is like a complete tangent, but the funniest one I remember is not engage 3 houses maddening mode, where they specifically like that was patched in like 2 or 3 weeks after the game came out, and it was still just inflated stats.
Yeah. But yeah, so hard mode exists, is a thing in Fire Emblem 6.
Yeah, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. I think it kind of the way it's been implemented, I feel like just both in this game and the other games, is kind of just like it kind of just amplifies the flaws. Like the way it's implemented just amplifies the flaws of the base game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
So I think how much you enjoy the hard modes are kind of an indication of how much you enjoyed the base game.
Yeah.
Beyond like really extreme examples like 10.
Yeah, absolutely. If you were to replay the game, which would you pick?
Depends on how I'm feeling. If I want like a more casual run, normal. If I want a challenging run, hard.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I will say, and I am definitely like a Fire Emblem baby. So I'll be the first to admit. But I do think we didn't really touch on this much. I think you mentioned it earlier, but like FE6 normal mode is actually better balanced than I think most other games on their respective lower difficulties.
Yeah, I actually really like the balance in normal mode. I think that it's like a really good balance between like a pretty breezy game while also like not feeling toothless.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. I think some maps like Arcadia, Chapter 7, Chapter 11A are like legitimate challenges even on normal mode.
Yep. Yeah, okay. And I think again, we'll talk about true end stuff later, but I think the true end also kind of helps it feel like it's pushing you to like actually challenging you.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a good segue. Let's talk about the true ending and the guide and requirements and stuff like that, because that's kind of what I wanted to talk about next anyway.
Yeah, and it's also something I wanted to make sure that we talk about in this episode.
I think we can keep it kind of brief, because I think we did have a discussion about it in one of the previous episodes. But I think I can let you make your pitch for why you think it's the way that they're designed is good, as I believe you do. Am I correct in assuming that?
You are incorrect in assuming that I make reasonable arguments, but essentially I really like the hard mode, the true. I like the true end, in, like the implementation of the true end in this game a lot. I get the points against it, specifically where it's like it's kind of guide game ish, where it's not really like super intuitive that there would be a true end or how you get the true end specifically. You kind of have to hug like a guide back in the day or FE WAD like in modern in today. But the main thing that I like about the true end is specifically it's tied to the guidance, and the guidance are tied to characters being alive and
turn requirements.
Yeah, turn requirements. So completing a map within like 25 or like 30 turns. The turn requirements never really feel like too excessive. Like 25 and 30 turns are not super hard, but it also does feel like, okay, I can't chill this map too much. I want to essentially like be relatively aggressive and make sure that I can get to the end, get to the seize point beyond, at least like kind of have the seize point in my sight within those number of turns. And that's part of the reason that even on normal mode, I like the balance, because even on normal mode, it's kind of pushing you to play relatively fast. The true end is not really like a FE6 specific thing, and this is part of the reason why I think it's kind of closer to the 1 and 3 ideal, in which like 3 is like 3 and 6 I think are the only games with true endings, at least the way they implement them. Where you get extra maps by essentially playing the game well. In 3's case, it's more side objective based than guide and requirement based. I like 6's a little bit better just because of the turn requirements, and also it encourages you to play resource management with your legendary weapons. And the reward feels really good. I talked about this in the endgame episode, but I like the reward for that essentially being running around, like just kind of being able to go all out after your prep like the entire game. And specifically why I like true ending. I'm not sure if it's the best implementation of this, but I've heard it said that like the Fire Emblem series as a whole, essentially your reward for playing the games well is pretty much just making the game easier. Like, for doing side objectives, your reward is like extra resources or stat boosters, or like in Tellius' case, bonus experience, where you're essentially just making your units better, and by making your units better, you make the game easier. And that kind of hampers the difficulty curve, where most of these games kind of feel like they have a reverse difficulty curve, where like the beginning of the game is like relatively either tight or just like hard in the case of like too hard in the case of the hard modes. But then the later game almost feels like a breeze. I would kind of I would like the Fire Emblem series to kind of look into ways to try to even that out. I think the true end requirements are one way of going about it. Maybe not the absolute best way, but I appreciate the attempt. Like I said, if you don't get the true end, then I think the end of the game is just like not satisfying at all. Like it borderline does not make sense.
Yeah.
In this game, and also in 3. In 3, there's kind of like an implication that, like it's like the regular end, like the not true end, is kind of a ruse, or supposed to kind of feel off. But in this game, it's pretty much they just fuck off.
They don't really do anything. They're just like, oh well, where did Idun go? Well,
whatever.
It'll probably be fine.
Yeah, they kind of just like, oh, it's whatever. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the guiding requirements aren't really like super well articulated in this game. But I like the attempt to at least like push the player to play well without locking without locking like newer or blind players out of being able to complete the game. And I'm not sure if the true ending is the way to, like, the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it.
Mm-hmm. I honestly agree with pretty much everything you said, except for the part where it's good. Uh,
Okay.
so what I mean by that is I think that you were completely right in saying that the Gaiden requirements are a great way to balance the game, and
Hmm.
that make it feel like you you do need to try to actually like get results in this game. I think for me, I think the problem comes where I would distinguish between. I don't think they're too hard in the sense that they require they're too difficult to execute. I think that they're the perfect difficulty in terms of
Hmm.
like the skills that you need to actually get the guiding requirements. Playing relatively aggressively, making sure you're not turtling too much, keeping your resources in check. I think that if you know all of those things going into the game, if you're not playing blind, then I think that they are actually phenomenal. I think that they're really, really good pieces of game design. I just think that they should have been more transparent, and I think that they
Hmm.
were so non-transparent that that is enough to hold them back from being anything other than kind of than bad. I mean, frankly, like personally, I think that if they had explained more, not through like tutorials or whatever, but then have been a little bit more transparent about the fact that you need to keep certain characters alive, the fact that if you use a legendary weapon, like it's going to cause problems for you later on. I think if they had been a little bit more transparent about those things, then I would be totally on board. I think that this would be a great way to execute those ideas. But because you aren't given that information, it's not even necessarily like you aren't given the information up front, because I think that can be fine. I think it can encourage a second playthrough. But like take the Milady and Zeiss thing where you need
Uh
to
huh.
keep them alive to access chapter 21X. No one tells you that even after you fail, right? Like there's
Uh
no,
huh.
oh man, if only Milady and Zeiss were here, they could have helped me, or something like that. Obviously less, fourth wall breaking than that, but I'm sure they could come up with something. Uh, I think if they had been more transparent, and they do kind of do this sometimes with the Gaiden, like the turn requirements, right? Where there'll be a bunch of guys that show up and they're like, oh, we sealed away the legendary weapon. Like that's good. That's what I'm
Hmm.
talking about. If there was more of that, then I think that this could have been an unambiguously great piece of game design that I think makes the game both more replayable and more difficult in a way that feels fair and balanced. But because it ultimately boils down to, I feel like, trial and error. Like, oh, I played through the game a second time, and this time I didn't accidentally get Zeiss killed, so I got the good ending. And I would have no way of understanding the correlation between those two things.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fair. The later games, like specifically, I remember like some Paralogs and Fates and s- some specific maps in like Three Houses and Engage where they actively give you a pop up to tell you exactly what the side objectives are. That might
Yeah,
benefit this game. It might be a little bit awkward if like they have to tell you like, hey, you should have kept this unit alive that you got like 15 chapters ago and may have already let die.
that maybe could use some workshopping. I'll agree. I don't think they should like
Granted,
explicitly
yeah,
tell you, but I think they could have like hint at it a little
yeah,
bit more.
I like that it's an incentive to pretty much just like if you don't remember who exactly you need, just to kind of keep everyone alive. But I get that like it is kind of obtuse. Like specifically like the with like the Milady and Zeiss one, it's like I don't know why you need both Milady and Zeiss to help you find the legendary weapon. Like probably one of
Yeah,
them won't suffice.
I think that if they had made it more limited in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
um, then and you could the Shanna thing or the Ilya 20X Ilya requirement as well, or Sakai 20X. Um, where it's like if it was only Zealot or only Juno or only Diane, that you needed to keep alive for those maps, then I think they could have gotten away with being less transparent.
Yeah,
Um,
like specifically units you get in the map before, which
like what they
wouldn't
do
really
with
work for
Lumina.
20. Yeah, it wouldn't really work for 21X since you don't really get anyone in that map.
Well, they could maybe, yeah, I guess that's fair. I mean,
And it doesn't
Yeah.
really make sense to have Zeiss be recruited later.
Yeah,
That would make him
no,
worse.
I would agree. Hey, maybe make Gale playable.
Mm. I am not waiting to recruit him. He
That's
shows up
fair.
so late.
Have him show up earlier. It's
Yeah,
not a turn
sure.
thing either. It's a reinforcement zone, so you can trigger
It
it
is
early
a
if you want to.
reinforcement zone. That's the problem. Is that he
Um,
spawns way behind where the reinforcement zone actually is.
That's true, and he goes immediately for Merlinus. If Merlinus could recruit Gale, then that would be problem solved. You know.
Well, he goes specifically for Merlinus when, like, in my strategy where I just keep him, like, on that vendor, and for some reason Gale just does not attack him.
I was nowhere near that vendor. I had Merlinus kind of over towards the right for some reason. I don't remember why. I think actually because I saw you do that, and I was like, I want to make sure that Merlinus doesn't
he
get like
attack-
boxed in.
Yeah, does he attack you? Did he still, like,
No.
not attack him?
Yeah, he didn't attack, and he's still boxed up around Merlinus, and he didn't even move. Like I moved Milady into his range, and he didn't go for her. He just kept like T-posing next to Merlinus.
That's actually so funny that works.
I don't know what's up with that. But yeah. So overall, I think in a world like, you know, I play this game in normally, and in a world where I think most people are going to play this game with a you know, a guide to get the true ending. I think that it actually works very well. I actually have basically no complaints about that scenario. I guess maybe the turn limits could be a little bit stricter. That's another thing that we didn't comment on for difficulty, is that some games, I think 12 specifically, increases the strictness of the turn requirements to get guidance, which I think is good. I think that's a pretty good hard mode change. But anyway, I think that pretty much if you're playing knowing ahead of time what you need to do, then I actually really like the guidance system in this game. I just wish that it was a little bit less required to know ahead of time.
One thing I was thinking is, like, I don't know, maybe it makes sense instead of like a true ending, maybe you have like the same, like, if you complete it in a number of turns, you get like lore or something. Like, I'm specifically thinking of like 19XX from FE7, but where the requirement actually makes sense and isn't like a adventure game puzzle, like a point and click adventure puzzle.
Yeah, what the fuck is up with that? Yeah, no, I think that could be cool. I also think if it like, I'd be more open to it too if it didn't necessarily decrease the number of chapters, but like if it had to do with like whether or not you can save a dune. I mean, in context that doesn't really make sense, but just as an example, right? Like if you kept the same number of chapters, but like the actual outcome of the story was different, I think that could be better as well.
Yeah, actually, thinking about it, one thing that I think Three Houses does well characterization wise is by essentially like giving each character like their own paralogue. Maybe there'd be some sort of turn requirements and like keep X character alive for that. Plus, maybe I would like that if Three Houses was like a harder game and like actually required you to recruit people.
Yeah.
Rather than just like kind of just walk up to them in the monastery at best.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like if they had recruitment as the side objective, so it was actually challenging to keep some people alive, then you get like a paralogue that expands on some of the characters that might like knock out both the support system and the difficulty, like true end stuff. Especially if they gave you like also decent rewards from that. Like you can kind of hit all three. Where it's like,
yeah.
Incentive to do it each time plus like incentive to do it plus story, like extra story, plus not necessarily being needed for like a full run.
Yeah, I think there are definitely ways that you could you can improve it. It's just, you know.
Yep.
I think the execution leaves a little bit to be desired here, but I think you would even agree with that, obviously.
Yep.
I think it's a cool concept, though. I think that they
yeah, I appreciate it for trying, and I feel like most games don't really try there.
Yeah.
That's one thing I like about it.
Absolutely, I can get behind that. Okay, now we have one point here about unit balance that I kind of skipped over. Now I don't know if I actually have that much to say about unit balance, honestly. Other than that, I think it's bad.
Yeah. I mostly brought it up because we were kind of getting into a big argument about it last night.
Oh yeah.
But it's essentially like this is kind of like something that people knock against six is that like, and I even brought it up myself where like I feel like the top tiers are like pretty well balanced, but pretty much everyone like mid to low, like there's a lot of like trash that like this game gives you. When I brought up this is like kind of going back to the idea where I was like this, like even if it follows a formula, it kind of feels like formulaically closest to the Arcanea games, and I think just the sheer amount of units that they give you is, regardless of quality, is part of that. I personally kind of like there just being unambiguously bad units in these games, just because of the allure of like, oh, I trained up like Wendy in this run, and it sucked, but like, look, I made her kill the final boss. I think that's pretty fun. Like in the newer games, like units are actually pretty well balanced, so it's like, and probably engage probably even like really bad units engage like kind of have like some kind of niche, or at least are trainable. And I think that's kind of a testament to their system mechanics more so than their unit balance. Which, yeah, I mean, like, even bad units should be trainable, but I think there is a specific allure to, like, look, I trained this, like, unambiguously bad unit, and that kind of is like a fun run idea, but I kind of agree that like there's maybe like too much volume where like too much volume of units that are like pretty much expendable, or like even when we were talking about unit balance yesterday, it's like, wow, a lot of these units are pretty much interchangeable.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think for me, what would make the difference is not necessarily like I don't want every unit to be good. I think I completely agree with you that there is a lot of fun using characters that are bad, in every game. And I tend to personally gravitate towards those characters just because I have fun with those personal stories of like, oh, this character was really bad, but I used them to beat the final boss, like you said. I think what I would like to see more of, and what I think absolutely happens in some games. I think maybe Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn are good examples where it's like I would like to see it more evenly distributed, I guess, where there's like some good units and some really really bad units like Sophia and Wendy, and then there's like a bunch in the middle, which is kind of like what we have here. But in FE6, I feel like there's a very strong concentration towards like the lower end. Whereas I would like to see more of a distribution between like there are some pretty good units and some like average units, and then some kind of bad units, and then some like really bad units. I think that would be a little bit more my speed. Whereas I feel like in this game it's like there's the five here. Let's pull up that tier list that we made since you brought it up.
That's like tier listing this game is honestly like kind of a futile endeavor just because of how like there's a huge, like I feel like there's a huge gap, but there is a massive gap between the top tiers and the bottom tiers, but like in the like kind of that nebulous mid tier, like mid tier to lower mid tier, it's just like I don't know, it's just like like especially when you get to the lower tiers, it's like what's the one thing that they can do for you?
Exactly, it's like I'm looking at I'm looking at the tier list, and it's like everyone in like the tier with Ellen in it.
Yeah, everyone. I feel like everyone below B is just like not worth talking about.
Exactly. I think that's exactly right. And then like the characters in B and above are fun to use. And I think I just wish that like some of those characters from the lower tiers were like moved up a little bit to like B and C. Like fucking, we put Gonzalez way too fucking low. We were on crack cocaine. I think like OJ and Trek and Lot and God, especially like Wade and
Yeah,
Boars.
Gonzalez, I feel like at least kind of has a niche. He's just screwed by being an axe unit and like
Yeah.
I think he's screwed by being an axe unit in like the lowest one of the lowest hit rate games.
Yeah.
Like it's specifically a game that's not nice to axes.
That's
Um,
definitely true.
yeah, and this is probably something I should have brought up in the hard mode discussion where, um, like the hit rate formula kind of does like genuinely gimp the game. Like if we did see a remake, I would like them to at least like have ways to work around that, if not just like flatly like reduce the amount of luck and avoid that enemies have.
Yeah.
But I think that is kind of a testament to like good system mechanics will kind of salvage those bad units. Like if even if the hit rates were across the board better, that would make units like Sophia and Wendy at least a little bit more trainable. Because they could at least like scrape up kills until they can like genuinely get going without having
Yeah.
to worry about like missing a 50% and then just like dying on retaliation.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing about like Sophia and Wendy in particular is that like you look at like other comically bad units in games like FE8, FE9. I think obviously Donald from Awakening is a huge example of this. They are bad, but there is genuine return on that investment. It's not worth it, obviously, if you're trying to play efficiently. But it's like
Mm-hmm.
if you use Donald, he will be very good. Whereas if you use Sophia, will she? She's like she has pretty average growth rates. Same with
Uh,
Wendy.
it's
It's
also
like
average FE6 growth rates, which are like
yeah,
30%. So yeah,
yeah,
the growth rates in this game are coin flippy, which kind of
yeah,
gimps units that join, with yeah, it gimps growth units a lot, like
for sure.
specifically like the ones that join at lower levels.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things where it's like they don't even make the bad units that fun to use in comparison to later games, which I feel like the trainees from FE8 I think are a good example. Where it's like Amelia and Ewan are fucking terrible, but hey, you get to make funny phantoms with Ewan, and you get extra levels to grow,
Mm-hmm.
and you get another paladin, and you get another pink general. Like there's
Yeah,
there's like genuine
yeah,
they put effort into making those units uh, extrinsically fun to use instead of just
uh-huh,
like I want to use a bad unit.
yeah. Eh, I think that's fair. But I do still like the units needs basically being I am so unsalvageably bad.
That's fair.
Like just from a I guess just from a meme standpoint really, but I don't know. It's fun to see people at least like it's sometimes fun to like have that as a challenge run and two like see other people like do their absolute best. Six is maybe not the best game for it just because of its fairly basic system mechanics. So even like even maximum investment is still not really that much investment. So you just dump XP and like stat boosters into them,
Yeah.
and then they still may not turn out good. Like if it was like say engage, you could say and dump a whole bunch of skills into them and like good emblem rings, and then they probably turn out pretty good.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that was basically all that we had to talk about for the gameplay.
Hmm.
Um, Now I think we can kind of move on to talk about some of the narrative stuff because we spent a lot of time talking about the story in the last episode that we recorded together. And I
Hmm.
think we can maybe keep this section a little bit briefer than the gameplay bits, especially since we're running up on 2 hours, which is fine. I don't mind. There's no like episode max limit, but I would like for this to not be a 3 hour episode.
Yeah, that's fair. I think the main thing that I mean, we talked mostly about the lore.
That's
Um,
yeah.
Knowing the lore now, how do we feel about like Alib existing like as a whole as a continent. Like I guess kind of beyond like the lore of the Scouring, like Alib as we see it in the game, like the current state of Alib.
I think that there could have been more done with it. For a game that really takes you to, I was impressed that they really, depending on the routes you go everywhere in Alib. You go to Nabata, you go to Etruria, Ilia Sakay, the Western Isles, Bern, and Lycia are all present. You play maps and all of them, but you don't. I feel like compared to a game like Path of Radiance, or Radiant Dawn, where you really don't get a sense of what those places are like as well as I would like. Western Isles is probably the biggest exception. Etruria too. I think Western Isles and Etruria are pretty good in this regard. I didn't really feel like I learned that much about Ilia, especially. I think Sakay is a little bit better, but I think Ilia was kind of hung out to dry. I think Bern, despite being the main villains of the game, I think they could have done more with their kind of history and relationships.
I mean, I kind of agree. Like, I appreciate that you go pretty much everywhere in Alib. Granted, like, the way the story is laid out, you don't really get a feel for, exactly what some of these some of these countries are like. You get that. I think the best is, like, specifically, like, the early stuff with Lycia and then some of the middle portions with Etruria. But you don't really get... I mean, you kind of can't really get too much of a feel for Bern because you're not really there. You're mostly just there to fight Zephiel.
Yeah.
You don't really get much of a feel for Ilia or Sakay because most of that is just, like, getting dumped with Zephiel's backstory kind of in little pieces. And most it's like, Ilia mercenaries, Sakay nomads, got it good.
Yeah, basically. You get more fleshed out. Ilia gets more fleshed out in supports than in the story, which is wild.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
But yeah, I think Alib. I mean, compared to where we came from, right? It's like obviously Yggdrasil fucking knocked this out of the park, but Arcanea is not so much,
I like Arcanea as a continent, but a lot of it is lore more so than the stuff you actually see in the story.
Yeah.
I'm mostly comparing it to, I guess like Awakening Fates and like Awakening Fates, Three Houses, and Engage to an extent, where these are like the lowest bars possible. So I don't think that's fair, but
yeah,
I'm not sure if that's 100% fair, but like, I mean, Fates does show you everything, but doesn't really. It kind of feels like the world still revolves around you to an extent. It kind of feels fairly shallow, and then Three Houses, like, it feels like a pretty lively world, but you just barely see any of it.
Yeah, there's all these names. There's all these places named after older games, like the Brigid Plains, the Brigid, the country, the Teltian Plains.
You're kind of limited to like the maps that they were able to design for the game, which they reuse a lot. But
yeah, sure.
And to be fair, Three Hopes actually does like kind of help a lot with fleshing out some of the stuff you didn't get to see.
That's good. I still need to play Three Hopes. Maybe I'll do that soon.
It's like actually pretty good at supplementing, like the story on its own. Like I'm sure you've probably heard that it kind of falls apart by the end of each respective route, like kind of by design. But like it does actually do a good job of like showing you people and places that you would have expected to see in the original game. But you don't, like most infamously Hulse, for example, where he's kind of like almost memed for like just being like just barely off screen, but like having some excuse to not show up on screen.
Yeah.
But he is in Three Hopes, and they make a point out of him being playable.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think compared to Fates in particular is like that's a low blow, man. This is below the belt. But I think there are definitely games that do it worse without being completely awful. I think Awakening is a good example. Like, there's some good stuff in Awakening that I like in terms of its fleshing out its world.
It's no Yggdrasil, it's no Tellius, but it does like fine, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of like, even story-wise, it's kind of like establishing a formula. So
Yeah.
even story-wise, it kind of feels bare bones.
I think that what's interesting about you saying that, though, is that I think this game does we didn't really talk about this, at least not that I can remember the last time when we recorded the last episode. But, like, how often in these games do you fight a big evil dragon at the end, right? Like, it's basically every game. How many games do you, like, save the dragon at the end? Like, that's a lot less common. Unless you want to count, like, Robin from Awakening, I guess.
Not really. You save the good dragon, not the evil one.
Well, I mean, you don't. Like, Milla in Echoes, she dies.
I'm thinking because you are the good dragon, like Robin earlier or something.
Oh, yeah. I guess depending on your choices in Three Houses, I guess this is a more recent game, so I do feel the need to warn about spoilers. But Rhea can die in Three Houses. She doesn't always, but she can. So it's I think it's interesting that, like,
there are some kind of like there are some like differences that are kind of interesting. They're kind of mainly superficial or kind of minor or understated, but I was actually like looking at the wiki page before this, and there's like this funny like trivia factoid where it says like this is the only game that does not have a dark mage as the major antagonist. And I'm like, yeah, there is no evil cult in this game, which is like kind of a staple of the series, is to have like some sort of evil cult that's like actually pulling the strings.
Yeah, and this game doesn't have that. So I think it is in some ways it is a legitimately experimental take on the traditional formula. Like, fight big dragons. Sorry, go ahead.
It's kind of like it's still like kind of establishing the formula, but there are some sort of like interesting twists compared to what came before, like a little bit more sympathy for the dragons than we saw before. Some implications that actually like if we're like, I was gonna say like the holy weapons being fucked up, but like it kind of are in Yggdrasil.
I don't
not like literally that they are nukes, but more that holy blood is fucked up and is like super politicized and like sought after in a way that isn't really explored the same way in 6.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think I can see if like you like the political intrigue of something like Yggdrasil or Tellius, then you would be turned off by this game.
That's true. Yeah, I agree. It's just it's trying something a little bit new, that I think is cool. Overall, I think it's kind of where I'm at with it. How do we feel about Roy? Roy. I'm gonna name the episode this. I almost forgot, but I'm gonna name it Roy's Our Boy. I haven't used it the entire series. I've restrained myself, but the weights are off. I'm on some Rock Lee stuff. The weights are off. Roy's Our Boy. How do we feel about
him? Roy is. I mean, like Roy is probably, if like either top 2, if not my favorite lord, but like my opinions with this game, it's kind of like mixed, but I kind of I like he's kind of a lord that I like, warts and all.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you've done have you done the support episode on him yet? Because I want to try to not step on your toes too much for like the actual content that it supports.
No, in fact, actually, I didn't. It completely slipped my mind that's what it's kind of what we were kind of talking about doing that in this episode. I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, this episode is gonna run pretty long by necessity, so I don't want to go into the actual content of his supports, especially since I haven't read them all recently, but
Sure.
um, I think there is a pretty big difference between main story Roy and support Roy,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of works, kind of doesn't. So in the main story, it kind of feel like is kind of like almost just Marth in the main story. He's kind of just like that guy. Um, he's pretty much like righteous, and like um, kind of like pretty much like he always kind of has the best course of action, pretty
Yeah.
much. Like, and they kind of set up Merlinus like kind of to be like the kind of like old cynical advisor for him to kind of shoot down and be idealistic and like make it work um in the main story. So like it like just based on like entirely based on the context, he's just kind of like okay. He's a little bit shonen protagonisty in that way, but I think the supports do a lot of work to kind of flesh him out as like to flesh him out as kind of like this kid that's in over his head,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of like the initial premise of him is that he's kind of just thrown into this position of leadership that he is like barely ready for. He pretty much is like just out of school, and
Yeah.
he pretty much has to lead this army, and the story is pretty much just him proving himself. And I think the supports do a good job of like kind of showing his internal struggles, like in his Alan support. I think it's Alan specifically. It's one of the Christmas calves, but he basically has like he basically is talking about how he's like staying up all night to figure out this plan for the battle, and trying essentially working through all his options to make sure that no one dies, or he specifically minimizes casualties.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and other supports like this might have that might have been the land support. I'm pretty sure in the Allen support, one of his supports, I know he talks about like his deep insecurity with actually leading the army and feeling like that he needs to be on the front line because he is specifically like not better than everyone else, and like people would not believe in him unless like he was pulling his own weight like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like he
You
kind
had.
of has to be because he's like not better than everyone else, and he would not
Mm-hmm.
be like a he would like no one would really like believe in him unless he was like kind of putting his money where his mouth is.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a lot of like, and this is not a new observation in any way, but there's a lot of like kind of imposter complex type. There's a lot of like imposter complex type dialogue where he's like, I don't think I'm worthy of the position I'm in, but I'm going to do my best to live up to that. That's kind of what I like a lot about him, and kind of what sets him apart from the other lords. In some of the like, and kind of it's not really like anything that other lords don't deal with. Is like their worthiness. Like Leaf like also deals with it a lot, but I think that kind of positioning Roy as like this younger lord who's kind of thrown into a position of power and kind of has to like do his best even though he's like super in over his head is kind of like his that's something that all lords deal with, but I think like Roy being like kind of like the young gun kind of
Yeah, I mean, he's one
gives
of
him a good position.
he's one of the youngest lords in the series, I think.
He's tied with like Leaf. He's like he's in that 15 range, like him, Leaf, Japanese Lin would
Yeah.
also be the 15-year-olds. But Leaf is like specifically also like Leaf kind of gets challenged a little bit more, which I can see why you would like kind of gravitate towards Leaf since he's not really idealistic. He's a little bit naive in a lot of ways that Roy isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And he's specifically like making mistakes that Roy wouldn't. So he's maybe a little bit like more plucky, and then Lynn, her conflict is less about getting in a position of leadership and more being about kind of not wanting to be where she is. There's a lot of conflict between like feeling that she has to be a noble when really she wants to just be like a plainswoman. So she's pretty much a completely different character.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the point of Roy being that I was making with Roy being so young is that like all the lords are like kids in a certain sense, right? But like he's really being thrust into this, and like what I think we see in some of his supports, I think is the Walt support is actually a really good example. He is being thrust into this world, and like we're seeing in real time everything change around him. Like his whole life is changing before his eyes. Like Walt used to be his best friend, and now he's turning into more of a traditional royal retainer, and Roy does not like that. He doesn't want it. It's like, no, go back, fuck.
And Roy's a lot like kind of fresher in that than someone like Marth or Leaf would be, where they've lost their countries like a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You could probably parallel them to like Ike, where like that kind of like he kind of loses his father in the middle of the story, but I feel like Roy, in comparison to other lords, kind of has more guidance, where like Cecilia's around, Eliwood's still alive, like the whole story. So like he feels like he has people that he can fall back on, but he also kind of needs to still take up the position of leadership because no one else can.
Yeah.
So it's that's kind of where he is versus the others. I feel like we've probably talked some about how it kind of feels like the story doesn't really do a great job of exemplifying that, or making that it doesn't do a great job of like showcasing that.
I would agree.
So you kind of just have to like infer that from his supports, which you probably won't get for the most part. I like that it kind of like portrays him as like kind of trying to act stoic when really like you can kind of see through his supports that it's a little bit more of a front.
Mm-hmm.
I think that like the later games and like the spin-off games like Heroes and Engage, I feel like they lean a little bit more into that personality, which kind of flanderizing his character, but I feel like it works out pretty well. Specifically, like in Heroes, I like the original version. I like his like crit quotes where he kind of sounds kind of like a little bit desperate and like a little bit like manic, where he's like I think like one of the ones I go back to is like he has like the quote where he's like, "I won't lose, I won't," where he like is like trying to like
almost like he's convincing himself.
Yeah, trying to convince himself. Or like he has one that's like, "There's my opening," where he's like, I think Ray Chase does like a really good job portraying him.
Mm-hmm.
Basically.
Yeah, that's excellent. Voice acting can flesh out a lot of characters. Very well. I think Roy's a good example. But yeah, I think an element of Roy that you see a lot in his supports that doesn't really come out in the main story is that that duality between understanding that time is always moving forward and that he needs to leave the past behind, but not being entirely comfortable with that. You know, like he doesn't want Marcus to retire. He doesn't want his friends to treat him as anything more than he really is. But then he also has the support with Lilina, where he says, it was a line, he says, "We can't go back to the past, but we can shape the future. Then we should work to make a future that the same as or even better than the past." Which I think sums up his character really well. You know, like he's constantly moving forward while being uncomfortable with the shifting in his role and in the world around him, but he understands that the only thing he can do is make the most of it.
Yeah.
Which,
I think that's a good way to put it. He is kind of shonen protagonisty, which I think could turn some people off, where he's like,
some shonen
kinda just
protagonists
that
are really
guy.
good, you know?
yeah. I was gonna, what I want to compare to, and trigger warning for My Hero Academia, but he kind of reminds me of like the early Deku,
Mm-hmm.
where he's kind of just like the kid that's kind of just like thrust into a situation and essentially just doing his best to kind of live up to what he needs to be.
Yeah.
Um, and then it kind of flips over where the later Deku kind of reminds me of Story Roy, where he kind of just feels generic. But that's neither here nor there. I don't want to get into a big discussion.
Mm-hmm. I'm particularly fond of the and I think we can after this. I know we don't want to get into like the specific supports too in depth, but I'm particularly fond of the Shanna and Sue supports where they like instead of just being an exploration of his character, it's on top of that they teach him something. Like Shanna teaches him to be more in touch with his, kid side and have fun and enjoy life. Whereas Sue teaches him to be more in touch with those around him and the world around him, which I think is cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think those end up, as Shanna in particular, I think is my favorite. I mean,
Yeah,
Lilina
Shanna
maybe...
supports.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I like Shanna support a lot because he's pretty much just like, how do I be happy? Please tell me how to be happy.
Yeah.
I forgot. I don't know.
That's definitely my favorite support. I would also say that Shanna is probably my favorite candidate for like romantic interest for him, other than maybe Lilina, just because they have like story relationship with Lilina. But just in terms of like, I think Shanna is like a very good compliment to him, which I think is good. Sue not so much. I think Sue is just kind of boring though.
That's more Sue. I think with Alina and them, I might be stepping on your toes for the support, but I feel like it's a little bit better for Lilina, since Lilina is part of her main conflict is feeling that she's not maturing as fast as Roy. So that's the Lilina support is more Roy being there for Lilina rather than the opposite.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't gotta feel like you're stepping on my toes. By the way, I feel like at this point we've talked about Roy in such a way where I don't feel like we really need. I don't feel like the need to do a full support analysis episode. I think this is good, because I think we're really getting into the nitty gritty of what I would say in that episode anyway.
That's fair, and you've probably if like Roy's last, like you would have gotten to all of his supports from the other side at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, supports are really where he shines, and I feel like it's part of the ideal of supports where like you actually see a different side of the character when you go into his supports. But I feel like I wish there was a little bit more of a hint of that. It feels a little bit better in the early game versus like the end of the game where he's kind of just like humans are good actually.
Yeah, I mean,
which I kind of do like his dichotomy with like Zephiel and like the way he interacts with Idun at the end of the game, but like I see how it's like a little bit boring.
Yeah, I also think that like the fact that he learns so much about the world is interesting. Like every place that he goes, he's being confronted with this idea of like, sometimes humans are shitty. Lycia, he has to deal with Eric. In the Western Isles, he has to deal with the Etrurian corruption. The Sakai and Ilia, there's traitors usually. Yeah,
I like the idea of like, oh, the world isn't as idealistic as I thought it was. That maybe doesn't manifest because like he kind of just goes through the game pretty easily without a lot of challenges.
Yeah, he doesn't really think or talk about it as much as I would like him to.
It might be just be a limitation of it being a Game Boy game, especially an early Game Boy game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I like about the dichotomy with Zephiel, like you were mentioning, is that if Roy was just some naive kid, which he kind of is, even at the end of the game, but if he was just completely inexperienced and didn't know anything about the world, then his words to Zephiel about the goodness of humanity wouldn't hold any weight. But Roy has seen, to a certain extent, not as much as Zephiel, but he has seen a lot of the worst humanity has to offer, and has still come out of that on the other side, believing that ultimately they are good. And I think that makes him a lot better of a foil to Zephiel than he could ever be otherwise.
So. Yep, I agree.
And then I just one last. This is a smaller thing, but I do really like the reflection of his character at the end when it's revealed that the Binding Blade reflects its owner's will, and obviously at this point he's fully committed to not killing Yadun. So I think that's a good mechanic for exploring that aspect of his character. But I think we talked a good amount about that last time too. But
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is kind of interesting that his ultimate final boss is like, they're generally indifferent towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it's highlighted best in like the end game of Engage, where like most people are like trying to like telling off the Dark Emblems of Roy. It's just like, what the fuck are you here? What are you doing here?
Yeah. Okay. So the last thing, unless I skipped over anything that you feel particularly interested in talking about, I think the last thing is talking about going into FE7. And FE7, obviously, is a prequel to this game. It's the first game in the series to do like a direct prequel. There's been obviously direct sequels and whatever the fuck Thracia is. I guess Thracia is kind of a prequel to Gen 2, but doesn't really come across
it's kind
that
of
way.
like it's Fire Emblem series. Like I was thinking about it before this episode, and I'm like, I feel like in my mind there were like a lot of sequel games, but actually thinking about it, it's like Mystery, which is a direct sequel, Gaiden,
Gaiden's like kind of a sequel, but it's very disconnected.
Yeah, Gaiden is a Gaiden.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's a side story, but it's also not like in the middle. Versus Thracia, which is a Gaiden in the sense that it literally happens in the middle of FE4.
Mm-hmm. It's like happening parallel.
Yeah, and then 7 prequel, 10 again is another sequel, but then after that everything's pretty much disconnected except for like 3 Hopes, which is a spin-off, and also like an alternate alternate canon. It's basically like more routes, essentially more routes to 3 Houses.
Yeah. It's like the beginning of the series is like the first half, I would say, is like very interconnected, and then after that it kind of starts to be. I mean, remakes. It's kind of skewed by the fact that there's a bunch of remakes thrown in there, right?
Yeah, actually, I probably should actually call Awakening like a pseudo sequel because it technically happens. It's technically a sequel to Arcanea, but not really. It's a sequel. It's a soft C-boot of Arcanea.
It's like a sequel in the same way that Breath of the Wild is a sequel to Ocarina of Time, you know?
Yeah.
It's like technically it's connected, but it's like very, very far in the distance.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so prequel is then in that case is FE7 literally the only prequel? I can't think of another one. Again, like
it would.
What?
Actually. There's one other prequel, Pushed Up Glasses. It's BS Akenia Saga.
I knew you were gonna say that. Yeah, and I mean, like, eventually those got adapted to the bonus menu of FE12. So I'll eventually talk about those as well. But like, yeah, if you want to count that as its own game, which is valid, then it would also be a prequel. But yeah,
I kind of count it as like the first DLC in the series.
It is
more or less.
Yeah, it is very, very DLC-esque.
Considering it is literally downloadable since it's from the Satellaview, which is like a broadcast system. Mm-hmm. Technically, actually, that wouldn't really be a download. That would be a broadcast, but
it's close enough.
It feels like a DLC.
Yeah.
It's like if you count that as a prequel, you also count the DLC from SOV as a prequel.
Yes. I feel like we're getting very caught up in the semantics of what a prequel is. But I think with the point that we're both trying to make is that FE7 is a prequel to this game, one of the only in the entire series. And without getting too in the mud about whether FE7 is a good story or not, like I'm going to do an entire podcast about that. But I think more relevant to our conversation here is was it needed, and was there anything that the game, like, in a world where FE7 hasn't come out yet, like, let's imagine you just played FE6 and you heard that a prequel is coming out, like, what do you feel like it could have addressed? Is kind of where I'm at.
Essentially, like, how do we feel about FE7 if we kind of think about the context of not having played FE7 yet? Because I feel like the general Fire Emblem fan experience is, since FE7 was like the first game localized and FE6 was not localized at all, like, you're inevitably gonna play 7 before 6.
Pretty much always, yeah.
Yeah, not a lot of fans kind of internalize it as 6 is a sequel to 7 rather than 7 as a prequel to 6.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, having come directly out of 6, coming directly out of 6, and this is kind of a preface for probably your episodes on 7, but I think it's interesting to think about how does 7 actually expand on 6 rather than the opposite? Because I think people were expecting 6 to expand on 7 when really it's the opposite. 7 expands on 6.
Mm-hmm. So I think I would say, me personally, not that well. And again, I don't want to get too deep into specific FE7 criticism, but I think what I ended up coming away from looking at both of those games, there are a lot of things that I think could have been addressed in an FE6 prequel. Like, if I just knew nothing about an FE7 and just heard that it was an FE6 prequel, I would think maybe they're going to get into some of the stuff about the Scouring. I would have loved a game about the Scouring, or about like the founding of Arcadia, or about some of the conflicts in Burn, or that is kind of what we get in FE7, but or in Sakai and Ilia. Like there's a lot of potential there. I think what they ultimately settled on is good, in the sense that I think making a game about Eliwood and Hector was honestly a stroke of genius. I think both of those characters are interesting enough where, like, they have a history, they have a history with each other, and kind of exploring that, but they're just such blank slates in FE6 that you could basically do anything, and it would work.
Yeah, there's maybe a handful of supports that talk about them, but not really that much. They're kind of like blank slates where they're kind of exists, and they kind of exist just to be kind of the ideal that Roy and Lilina to an extent strive to.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know much about them specifically.
Yeah. And I think, in a sense, throwing Lyn into the equation was a bit of a questionable move. I don't even think Lyn is a bad character, again, without getting into too many details, but I think she did kind of add more fat to the game than was necessary, and I think she kind of cluttered the story in places that she didn't really need to. And I think what ultimately I ended up not liking, again, I played 7 first, so saying that I didn't like this at the time would be obviously disingenuous, but I think in retrospect, I don't necessarily like what they did with Zephiel. I think Zephiel, they had potential to expand on that framework and talk a little bit more about Zephiel, but I think what they ended up, frankly, they ended up contradicting some of the stuff that happened in 6, but even if you want to think of it as like a retcon, I think it does... It has some issues that I'm not super fond of.
I actually kind of disagree with that. I think that, and I still have to... Part of the reason why I decided to draft FE7 immediately after finishing my 6 hard mode was because I wanted to essentially go through this perspective and, okay, how does 7 actually expand on the story of 6? And I haven't gotten to the Zephiel parts, but from what I remember from them, I'm pretty sure they're pretty consistent with the story that Guinevere gives in this game. Like
Um,
I actually like that's one of the things I like about it is that it actually shows you Zephiel's backstory instead of just kind of like expositing it to you.
well, so the thing about what happens in 7 is that none of it is like directly incompatible with what happens in what we're told happens in 6. It's just a matter of I think it's strains my suspension of disbelief a little bit. Like the biggest thing being the fact that Zephiel, I think I could be wrong actually. I could be misremembering what happens in 7, but Zephiel, there's an assassination attempt on his life in 7. Obviously, that's what we play in like Battle Before Dawn, and I believe he finds out that it was his dad at some
Yeah.
point. And it seems like that is a weird contradiction with what we see because then would he not be already against his dad? Like I guess the poisoning from his dad wouldn't have come as much of a shock. I guess if he already knew that he was out to kill Zephiel. So I guess
I think it's less that the poisoning is a shock and more that it gives him a an opportunity to get one up on him by faking his death.
yeah, that's fair. I guess in 6, and this is obviously this is reading into it, but I think in the context of 6, the poisoning is presented as kind of being the catalyst for his change. And it feels like that this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I suppose, but I feel like in 7 that is shifted back to the Black Fang assassination attempt. And the poison feels kind of superfluous in that context. Again, other than, you're right in the sense that it gave him an opportunity to get one over on him, fake his own death, etc. But I think that feels it feels less it feels weirdly uncalculated, I guess, in that sense. Like
Like, why would he just take whatever from his dad if he knows that he's out to kill him?
Yeah, and then also the fact that I would like that idea, I guess, if it had been a plan that Zephiel had made. If we find out maybe the post credit scene is Zephiel being like, all right, Murdoch, here's what we're gonna do, but that's not what happened. So it feels like he just kind of stumbled into that.
The way I would reconcile it is that in 6 you hear it like entirely from Guinevere's perspective. I'm not sure if she's aware that his father was out to kill him at that point because she was like 5 at that point.
Yeah, true. But yeah, so I don't think it's I don't think it's bad per se. I think I don't know how much I feel like it was necessary.
It's a little bit contrived that Eliwood and Hector are there.
Yeah, that's the other thing too.
That's the other thing is that it kind of has to fit in the story that's largely about Eliwood and Hector. So like this thing that probably should be relatively disconnected, they have to find their way in on.
And save him. Although he doesn't realize that they saved him. Does he?
I don't know.
Remember, to be honest.
It is funny to think about like he's like killing Hector knowing that he saved him as a kid.
Or the other way around, where it's like he doesn't know, but Hector does.
He like Hector's like, I should have fucking killed you
and let you die.
I should have let you die, man.
But yeah, so I'm reserving judgment. I mean, that's not true. I explicitly am not reserving judgment. But I'm not going to be too harsh in my judgment until I get to that point in FE7.
Yeah.
I think I'm open to changing my mind, basically.
Yeah, I think what 7 could really expand on from 6 is one little details like that where we're kind of mostly exposited to.
Yeah.
In 6, just by the fact that it is a GBA game, they didn't really have much capacity for like flashback scenes.
True.
Plus, seeing a little bit more of the world. Like we talked about it a little bit with Alib, where like places like Lycia and Etruria were more fleshed out, but Bern really wasn't. Just going to Bern in more normal times, like not in the middle of a war, kind of helps, even though it's still mostly just to see Zephiel.
Yeah.
A lot of, like, admittedly, there isn't a ton of room, so I feel like 7 just kind of messes about with its own thing that doesn't really connect super well to 6, like Black Fang as a whole. Like, I don't really need that too much. There's a good amount of, like, doubling down on the point that, like, oh, the dragons aren't too much different to us. We can live in harmony.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, we can Eliwood and Ninian are definitely living in harmony.
Yes. It's funny that Roy kind of goes through the. I don't even know if he would, like. I don't know the timeline. Like, would he know? Like, if it could be a potential like 3 different mothers, so you can't really write this in.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was Ninian, then like would he have known her long enough to know that she's a dragon?
I think that actually that I like that idea a lot. Realistically, I think the answer is probably no, and in fact, I think that's why they put that detail about her not living for very long in FE, like the end of FE7, because they didn't want it to be like, oh, where's Ninian? Why did Ninian not tell Roy any of this?
Regardless, his mother would have died from like a illness
Sickness,
or something. Yeah. Even if it was like Fiora or Lan.
Yeah, that's true.
But
I like that.
If he
idea,
did know,
that's a good headcanon.
If he did know, then he kind of goes through the same character arc as Eliwood, even though like, Actually, I'm wondering if that would be good context for him to like be completely trusting of dragons.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think he doesn't really have much of an opinion about dragons at the beginning of the game that we are privy to. Obviously, it gets fleshed out more later, but I think he doesn't really form many opinions about dragons until the end that he actually like expresses out loud. So it's hard to say for sure.
In the beginning of the game, it's kind of just like, holy shit, dragons exist. That's crazy.
That's fucking crazy, dog. I thought my mom was the last one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think FE7. Oh, one thing I do want to say, and this is less relevant to the story of FE6. Compared to 7, but it is something that's kind of like a background idea in 6 that gets fleshed out to be a huge main plot point in 7, which is the whole concept of dark magic corrupting you and turning you insane, which I think is chef's kiss, fantastic world building, honestly.
That I actually do think that's like one of the things that FE7 handles like better than most games in the series is just dark magic as a concept.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think Nurgle has some issues as a villain, again, which I will get into another time. But I think just the concept of him losing himself to dark magic is neat. Speaking of dark magic, actually, I had a fun little realization. I was reading some supports the other day, and you remember how I made a comment about Canis. From FE7 is an anima affinity, which was we joked about how, or I joked about how that was kind of in line with his more like balanced personality. He's like
he's just like out for any knowledge. He just happens to be a dark mage or something.
So I was reading some FE6 supports yesterday, or it was a few days ago, I think, and turns out Nime is also an anima affinity character, which I did not realize. I thought she was a dark affinity, because that would just make sense. But makes you wonder, maybe she used to be like that too. I don't know. It's just a nice thought that I had.
What's Hugh's affinity?
I think Hugh is also anima, but I could be wrong. It might just it's possible that it just runs in families, like but Lilina's
Oh,
light.
it is. Oh no, that's weapon level. I was looking at his weapon level. He's a wind affinity for some reason.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it doesn't really seem to run in families. But yeah. Anyway,
That could have been the intent of making Kanasa anima affinity though.
yeah, yeah. That could be. I don't want to read too much into affinities as as I could. I guess. I think that they are usually indicative of a character's personality. Like hot-headed characters tend to be fire. Characters who are more rambunctious tend to be like lightning. But for the most part, I think it's
Maybe it's
mostly
just
arbitrary.
Maybe it's the same as the tactician, and it's just their birthdays.
That's true. Honestly, we don't know most of their birthdays. That's a good point.
Yeah. I don't think we would know any of them because that didn't become a thing until Awakening.
Yeah. Okay. So that's all that I really had to say about FE7, unless you had anything that crossed your mind.
I think that's about it. Main idea is that I like that it shows some stuff, but like 90% of the story, I think they kind of gotta make up. That's
Yeah.
like one of the main complaints is like, oh, we're going to the Dread Isles, like the fucking evil isles that we never mentioned in 6,
Yeah.
so that we can do stuff that's completely separate.
It's also hamstrung by the fact that nothing in 7 can become public knowledge, because then people would know about it in 6, and it would be weird that they never mentioned it.
Yeah, it's kind of it kind of has to bend over backwards to line up with 6, which is like part of the reason why like some of the endings are just like really like feel really mean-spirited, like specifically Kanasa's ending where like he has to die.
Yeah. I agree. Okay. But yeah, that's all for FE7. The last thing that I wanted to talk about, and we are rapidly approaching 3 hours, but it's fine. It's fine. It doesn't matter. I wanted to hear your thoughts on a potential remake for this game, because I know there's been a lot of debate about, maybe debate's the wrong word, especially nowadays with all the rumors, but like for a while it seemed like it could go either way between an FE4 remake and an FE6 remake. Because of some statements and some like Roy being popular in Smash Brothers and things like that. Now, obviously, it's seeming increasingly likely that we will get, if anything, a 4 remake, and possibly never a 6 remake. Although I do think that a 6 remake is a legitimate possibility. I guess we can start there. Do you think that we will ever see a remake of this game?
I mean, I think they're going. I'm actually been a little bit more down on remakes. I'll believe them when I see them, but
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, like, if we get a 4 remake, I think we're also going to get a 6 remake. That seems to be the rumor, is that there were 2... Like, the big rumor is that there were 2 Fire Emblem, like, remakes canceled when the 3DS, like, when it was, like, obvious that the 3DS was not gonna have, like, too much longer of a lifespan. And the theory is that those would be, like, 4 and 6, respectively. So I think if they continue remakes, that they're definitely going to get there. I'm not 100% like, I'll believe I'll believe a 4 remake when I see it. Like, we're 5 years out from SOV. I don't believe that there's additional plans to remake 4 until we actually like see them announce it.
Yeah, sure.
Same deal with
rumors.
6. Same deal with 6. I think if it gets to 4, then I think they're pretty much committed to like keep remakes going. My main concern is that remakes just generally don't sell as well as just newer games. SOV didn't do, like, maybe got like had like I think like 40,000 copies, which is a lot lower than Awakening and Three Houses, which inevitably, like, older games are going to have a lot less interest than newer games because they're going to have the baggage of being older games.
Yeah.
Um,
People worried that you may need additional context for them and things like that.
Yeah, but they but Intelligent Systems is like genuinely interested in keeping the older games around, specifically for spin-offs like Heroes, where they can sell you older like characters from older games.
Yeah.
So I do believe that there is interest there, but I'm not 100% sure if that interest is like strong enough to remake the old games just quite yet until we see a 4 remake.
That's fair. I think you're completely valid. I'm personally optimistic. I think a 4 remake. I'm pretty convinced the 4 remake is coming at some point. When, who can say? Especially with the Switch, on kind of on its way out. Seemingly, I think they're probably gonna announce a new console next year. In fact, I think they may have even said that they were. But I could be wrong. I'm obviously not saying it's a guarantee, but I genuinely do think we're gonna see a 4 remake, and I think maybe this is a bit naive of me. Maybe I'm giving these guys too much credit, but I think aside from Heroes, obvious exception because it's a gacha game. I do legitimately think that Intelligent Systems is invested in making. When I say it like this, it's going to sound weird, but I think they're legitimately invested in making good games, and I think that they're obviously sales is going to be a factor. They're a business. I get it. Fuck capitalism, eat the rich. But whatever. I get it. They're not gonna make a game that they don't think is gonna sell well. But counterpoint, who the fuck thought that anyone who was trying to make a game that was going to sell well, whoever came up with the idea for a Gaiden remake was like, they would have thrown him out of the room immediately. You know what I mean? That feels like just as much of a labor of love than it feels like an attempt to make a quick cash grab. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, like, we definitely give Intelligent Systems some shit for rushing their games and definitely cashing in with stuff like Heroes, but I do genuinely think that they do have a lot of love for the series, and that's something that I do like about the modern games a lot, where it feels like they are willing to like celebrate their older games. Like, I don't know, it feels like I at least have a little bit more respect for Intelligent Systems than I would have for, like, say, Game Freak with Pokemon.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. Yeah, that's basically where I'm at with it. Like, obviously, I agree with you that I'll believe it when I see it. I am optimistic. I think that like we're in that pattern of like every time there's a direct, there's a rumor that FE4 is going to get a remake announced, and it's like, okay, eventually it's probably going to be true. If he keeps saying it, then eventually it's going to be right. But I don't know. I'm hopeful. 6, I'm a little bit more skeptical. I kind of strayed away from the main point here, but 6, I'm a little bit more skeptical on. I don't necessarily agree that if they make 4, they're definitely going to make 6. I do think it's more likely, but I don't necessarily think the two go hand in hand for me personally.
Before we stray off from 4 too much,
oh sure,
I do want to say that you brought up like the potential of like a Switch 2. I genuinely think if they do make more remakes, it's going to be like SOV, where they release it towards the end of a console's life cycle.
Fair.
I think it would be the smarter option to kind of have those be like the budget end of generation games versus like the kind of big launch games. Like, I would imagine they would want to make a splash earlier in the generation and then kind of just be like pleasing the fans near the end.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's valid. So maybe we will see one announced later this year for the end of the Switch's lifetime. Who knows? Or maybe not later this year, but like next year or something like that.
Yeah, I do genuinely believe that that's the biggest evidence. So I wouldn't be surprised if, like, I feel like after SOV they were expecting them to just pump these out, and maybe that was the original plan, but I don't think they're gonna pump remakes out.
I don't think so either. I mean, the gap between...
it'll probably be like a long time before 6.
You mentioned that we're 5 years out from SOV, but the gap between... I mean, obviously the circumstances of the franchise are completely different now than they were back then, but the gap between 12 and 15 was at least 5 years, 6 or 7, I think, right?
12 was like 2011 or 2012, I forget specifically, and then SOV was 2017.
So yeah, so it's
So
about the same
around
time frame.
5-6 years, so about the same time frame.
Yeah.
I mean, 11 and 12 were right after each other, but they're also direct sequels.
Yeah.
You can
So
use the same assets.
that tracks. Yeah. But yeah. So
So maybe
put-
they'll shit out a Thracia remake on the Switch like 4 years after the Switch 2 is out.
yeah, Teleus remake. Yeah, Awakening remake. Last of Us Part 2 remaster situation.
So people have Awakening remake has been like the rumor since the Switch came out too. So
Oh my god. Yeah. So I guess putting aside the feasibility of a remake,
like if assuming that it will happen.
yes. What would you like to see? Like maybe like two or three big things that you would like to see changed or
Admittedly,
improved upon.
I'm kind of at the place right now where I'm like, I kind of don't really care too much about what they do with the 6 remake, just because, like, 4 and to an extent 5 are lacking in a lot of the quality of life features that 6 introduces, but 6 is kind of like where the, like, modern quality of life stuff starts. So I'm perfectly content with just replaying 6. I don't really need it to be remade. In my ideal world, like my perfect FE6 remake would be kind of largely the same game, but with essentially hit rates adjusted, essentially just like lower enemy luck, reduce their avoid, the avoid tiles, make support grows faster, probably implement what I mentioned with keep the like support bonuses like pretty similar to how they were, but maybe just make it where you can get any support, but you just choose between the supports that you like actually have bonuses for. And then I don't know. This is kind of a game where I like it like kind of warts and all, even with like the stuff that's a little bit jankier. Kind of keep it as is. I think that janky like just kind of I know unpolished is a meme, but polish it up a little bit more. Make sure that Rapier actually works on nomads.
Yeah.
It's weird that it doesn't, and troubadours too.
Yeah, that is weird. Yeah, no, I think those are all very valid, very valid things to think. I mean, it's definitely. I think this game is good enough where I don't think it needs any like massive sweeping change. In fact, even for games that I don't, maybe this is a hot take, but like Shadows of Valentia often gets a lot of flack for being too faithful to Gaiden. But honestly, generally, I prefer a game err on the side of being too faithful than take too many liberties and kind of divorce itself from what the original is. I mean, I guess the original will always be there, but also it's like, I think part of the point of a remake is to capture what made the original unique, even if it's not always good,
And that's part of the problem with 6 and why I wanted to bring up the game's identity is that it doesn't really have as strong of an identity as something like, say, Gaiden or FE4 would. So I'm not really sure what a remake would look like beyond just kind of being the same game again, but maybe with, like, the modern systems. And that's mostly from a gameplay perspective. From a story perspective, I would be interested in seeing them, like, essentially overhaul the main story. Try to give us a little bit more in between the cutscenes and offload. Connect it a little bit better with 7. Offload some of the exposition to, assuming that happens in 7, so that, like, some of the other major characters like Lilina can have a little bit more story space.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that all makes sense. I think I'm right there with you. I think I would like to see some story adjustments, some more characters given screen time.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I'm comfortable with the game kind of staying as it is, which is kind of a boring. Usually, when someone says, "What do you want to see in a remake?" Nothing is kind of a boring answer. But I think we're
actually,
both on the same
give
page.
us. probably just like port some of the weapons and items from newer games back, maybe.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Give us a fucking brave
It's
sword.
yeah, like the weapon. I mentioned the weapon pool is kind of pretty small. Same with the item pool. I don't think that we need to like have skills or combat art in this game. In fact, I probably would prefer that they don't do that. Besides, like maybe personal skills.
Personal skills would be cool.
Yeah, I really like personal skills, and I think it's a little bit weird they don't have it in SOV. But
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really need skills in this game. In fact, I would prefer it to stay on the more basic end and not kind of embrace the skill emblem thing that newer games do.
Yeah.
Um,
That might be a little bit of too hopeful, I think. I mean, it was the last game without a shitload of skills was like 12,
SOV,
right?
SOV.
Oh, yeah, so yeah, okay, yeah, you're right.
So I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to assume. In fact, I think that is probably where they'll go with it. But
I was mixing up like skills and combat arts.
uh, combat arts, yeah, but I kind of feel like combat arts were essentially them messing around with stuff for Three Houses. So
That's
maybe
true.
they'll mess around with whatever new game they have in in Six Remake.
True.
Um, but I feel like they don't really need to do too much. Just kind of clean the game up a little bit, which like I'm not holding my breath for the Six Remake.
That's
Is
fair.
kind of what I'll say.
Well,
I would also, even though I'm a bigger Six fan than Four, I would prefer the Four remake before Six, just because I like the way Six is now for the most part. And stuff that I do have problems with, like really you could just like balance patch it if you really wanted to.
yeah.
Because it's mostly just like a balance thing. Um,
So let me flip the question around then. And again, I can predict kind of what you're going to say because the original game's always going to be there. So no matter how bad they fuck up the remake, it's not the end of the world. But just keeping that in mind, what would you say is like your like worst case scenario? Like what would you really not want them to put in this remake other than like skills and combat arts?
um, Admittedly, one thing that I was gonna say is that I really don't want them to. Like I mentioned, the characters being kind of bare bones, but I think that's part of the game's identity. Is like you kind of have a big cast, but like really, it's kind of closest to being blank slates, like kind of in the Arcania sense. It's just that, like they have supports, but like they aren't really like super interesting. I kind of don't want them to like gimmick the characters out. Like I don't want them to feel like, oh, each character has to kind of have their own gimmick. I want them to kind of be like kind of similar. SOV kind of overhauled the characters, but I don't really feel like any particular attachment to Gaiden, so I can't really complain or
Well,
say that's bad in any way.
Gaiden, the difference between 6 and Gaiden is that Gaiden had literally no characterization for basically anybody.
Yeah, Gaiden had like literally no lines. 6 has lines, but like a lot of characters are still kind of generic, basic-ish. Like no, like Wendy, she says a lot of stuff, but do you really feel any particular way about her character after all that?
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
I'll
I would kind of prefer them to keep it like that, even if it is a little bit.
yeah.
I would kind of prefer them to keep the characters as is rather than particularly overhaul the characters. I know the funny answer is to say like, oh, they're gonna put Lin as the main character.
I was
they're
gonna go
add
for the low hanging fruit there. Yeah.
they're gonna add an avatar in. I don't think they'll do that.
I don't think they're gonna add an avatar
They didn't-
either.
People meme that based on like 12, but I think there is like a genuine case for like an avatar improving 12.
And it's also like the first time they ever tried that mechanic. If they didn't do it in SOV, the amount of restraint it probably took them to not do it in SOV has got to be unbelievable. Like I like to imagine that there was just like one or two guys who were just like shooting down every like all right, we should put a avatar in. They're like, no, Absolutely not. We will not budge on this because, like,
Yeah, I mean, granted, an Avatar would like genuinely not. You'd have to like super overhaul the story considering that it takes place across two routes, like concurrently. Like,
an
how
avatar
can
for each.
you would need either two avatars or like a teleporting avatar?
Yeah, then that would be stupid. So maybe maybe it did have more to do with the game structure than anything else. This is maybe me being a little bit too harsh to intelligent systems, but I really like after 14, the fact that they didn't put an avatar in Gaiden was like a legitimate surprise to me. I think Fates was like. I was in super doomer mode after Fates came out, and I was like, they're just gonna put avatars in everything, and for the most part, that has been true. Although I think the avatars have gotten a little bit less centralized since.
I don't know this for a fact, but I feel like 12 pushed them away from using avatars. It's hard for me to say that for sure, but I feel like 12 kind of pushed them away from doing pretty radical remakes, because 12 is like a super radical remake.
It is, yeah, I agree. Which I think works in 12's favor. I mean, I know I did say that I like it more when they're err on the side of being faithful, but I also think that, like, I mean, I don't really have anything to compare it to since I've never played 3, and I like 12 for what it is. I think the problem is I see 12 less as a remake and more as like a standalone game. Like I've internalized it that way because I don't really know anything about it.
It works in 12 because the new version of 12 is pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah,
it works if they're. My hopes for 6 remake is for them to make it a good game.
Yeah, basically that's really all we can ask for. You know, at the end of the day, that's basically all that matters.
They can do whatever they want with it as long as it's not bad. But I mean I do kind of think that the other meme answer is for them to put Alan there, which I think is a little bit more like for whatever reason I feel like is more likely than avatars or them putting Lin in.
I
don't know why I feel that, but
I don't think they're gonna put Lin in. I think I understand why people think that, but I don't think they're gonna do it. Al maybe. Here's my hot take though. I could be kind of cool, to be honest. I don't know if I would necessarily hate that.
If they completely rework his character, then sure.
I mean, yeah, I don't know anything about his character, to be honest. I haven't read the manga, which is another thing.
Kind of like,
we should have talked about the manga at some point, but like, holy shit, this episode is we've already talked about so much. But maybe I'll do like a bonus episode on the manga at some point.
He's pretty much like Goku.
Oh, okay. All right. So unless you had anything else about a remake, I think we can start wrapping up.
Yeah, like I said, I genuinely don't have too many opinions on a remake. So I don't have too much more to say there. Just actually, my genuine nightmare scenario is them removing the boot shop. As long as the boot shop is there, it's gonna be a good game.
Absolutely, we need the boot shop. If they remove the boot shop, then it's soulless.
Like it's not FE6 without the boot shop. That's like literally.
So true.
I should have mentioned that when we talked about the game's identity. The game's identity is
boot shop.
saving all your money for the boot shop, and then just like going off for the last couple of chapters.
Yeah, I think that is a legitimate part of the game because how many other games let you buy movement stat boosters, like infinite movement stat boosters? I think it is literally none of them.
I don't know. The closest thing I can think of is the sticker ringing engage, because it pretty much just is give one character like max
double
boots
movement.
range. Yeah.
Basically. But yeah. All right. So I think that's pretty much everything. You know, in case it was. Surprisingly, after 3 hours, we've exhausted all the topics we could. We haven't even exhausted all the topics we could talk about, but we've exhausted all the topics that I think we should talk about today.
Yep.
A lot of good discussion here. A little bit disorganized, maybe, but I think overall, I mean, I guess just in a couple sentences, I like this game. I think it's good.
Uh-huh.
I think other games, for me, it's like smack dab in the middle of the series. Basically, I like a lot of games less than it. I like a lot of games more than it. But I appreciate what it does well. I appreciate the formula that it established, and I think it was an enjoyable time for me overall. I really like normal mode. I don't think I'll ever play hard mode though.
6 is my janky king.
I I love that. Love that. Okay. So thank you very much, Soup, for joining me. I'm glad that we got to spend so much time talking about your favorite game. I hope you enjoyed yourself as well.
Yeah, man, it's been a pleasure.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I will. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you around.
Thanks, you too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okie dokie. All right. Obviously, guys, I don't know what it's going to be like once I cut down all the bullshit, but 3 hours, 2 minutes currently on my timestamp. This is going to be a long one, so I'm going to keep this brief. Obviously, we don't have to do the map gauntlet. Next time, we're doing FE7. Very excited. We're going to be doing chapters 1, or prologue 1, 2, and 3. We're starting with Lin mode. And we're doing, I kind of, part of me wants to just do, like, go above my usual episode count, or my usual chapter count, and just knock Lin mode out in 2 episodes, but I decided against it. We're just going to do prologue 1, 2, and 3. They're going to be short. It might be a short episode, but I think you guys could use a break after this one, or maybe I could use a break after this one, but we'll have to see. But I'm definitely doing those chapters, and I'm excited to talk about it. I'm looking forward to FE7. I think especially Lin mode is very interesting to talk about, and yeah, so look forward to that. I'm going to quickly check the news, and I did beat quite a few games actually, but I think I'm going to save talking about them for next time, honestly. Wow, really, that's it. We got a new banner for Heroes, and that's it. Okay. Yeah, all right, so I'll save talking about the games that I've been playing for next time. Because this obviously, like I said, this episode is quite long. So that's all for me for today. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.